Okay, we're live. We are good to go. Let me just do one quick check, everybody. Alexander and Mr. Robert Barnes, the great Robert Barnes. Let me just do a check on Odyssey, on Rumble. We got YouTube, and we got Locals as well, the great Locals chat. So we are live. We are joined here with Alexander McCurse in London, and we have the one and only, the great Mr. Robert Barnes. Mr. Barnes, where can people find you real quick?
The best is always at vivabarneslaw.locals.com. That's where you can find all the content, create their own content. It's the only place where I read everything every day. So that's the best place by far.
All right. Definitely plug into Robert and Viva's channel on Locals. It is absolutely fantastic. Robert does these shows. I think it's a weekly show, isn't it, Robert? The Hush Hush.
Yeah,
Is it every week?
Basically, whenever it strikes, sometimes there'll be one a week, sometimes there'll be four in a week. It all varies, but they're basically alternative histories and alternative narratives to events, and they've been a little too predictive of late, sometimes unfortunately, but and sometimes fortunately. I mean, like the discussion of the Ukraine war going in a certain direction helped persuade some elected officials and would-be elected officials to take a certain path that they might not have otherwise taken. So there's utility to it. But yeah, if you want an alternative history for past events, predictions of future events, it's just an alternative take. It's based on James Ellroy's great American tabloid trilogy, and going back to L.A. Confidential, which is like an alternative narrative or interpretation of American history between 1963 and 1972, or thereabouts. And there's a lot of utility to seeing it as a template to how American power operates. It's kind of like Jean Le Carré, his Russia House, A Man Most Wanted. If you want to understand renditions, you got more accuracy out of that than you did out of official government reports in the United States at the time. Things like that.
Definitely well worth it. Definitely.
Absolutely.
The Hush Hush is a fantastic.
It's a fantastic.
Program.
Absolutely. I completely agree. I absolutely agree.
All right.
One of its kind as well, by the way.
Okay, so yes, absolutely. So let's get started. I'm going to pass it off to you in 1 second, Alexander, so you and Robert can get into all of the news and topics that we need to discuss. And boy, do we have a lot to discuss. Let me just say a quick hello to our moderators on the YouTube chat. I am seeing Alan Watson is with us. Who else is with us, Alan? Who's helping you out in the chat? Or is it just Alan tonight? I'm sure more people will join. I'm just seeing Alan right now. All right. So thank you, Alan, for moderating, and for any moderators that are going to jump in later on the show. Thank you very much. All right, Alexander, Robert, we have a lot of stuff to cover. I'm just going to say my 2 cents. 33 billion, actually 40 billion now is going to Ukraine. Biden has already burned through, I believe, 13.8 billion already. They're on the last 100 million. He just signed the Lend Lease. So we got more stuff heading to Ukraine as well. The EU is going to be taking out loans, 15 billion loans, $15 billion loans every 3 months in order to fund Ukraine. And we have 300 billion that was already stolen from foreign reserves way at the beginning of this. This is like peak insanity at this point in time. Anyway, that's all I have to say, because absolute madness what's going on. Alexander, Robert, the floor is yours.
Well, I agree, Alex, but can I also say that I remember something that Robert asked us on a program, which is whether we could ever remember an administration more disastrous in modern American history than this one. And I have to say, I simply don't now. I mean, I think at the time Robert asked that question, it was already looking incredibly grim. It seems to me everything is going, not just coming apart, but everything is going wrong in the most extraordinary, ludicrous way. And I have to say, there's an element of senility about this. I mean, Lend-Lease, this all it's an old man. It seems to me, it reminds me of an old man He remembers the stories of his childhood about, Lend-Lease during the war and how it, transformed the situation of the Allies, in Britain and the Soviet Union too, by the way. And I think he and the people around him think that they can relive all of that. So they're going to have Lend-Lease for Ukraine and for the East European countries. But you've got to understand something about Lend-Lease. Lend-Lease works in two ways. Firstly, the country that's provided with the weapons has to pay eventually. But who pays in the meantime? The US government does. It's the US taxpayer. It's not free. It's not just, money, weapon systems appearing out of nowhere. So in effect, what this Lend-Lease program is doing is it's committing the United States to a kind of unlimited arms buildup, as far as I can see, in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, with Uncle Sam writing the checks. Now, I don't know whether I have understood this right, Robert, but that's how it comes across to me. And of course, if you think that Ukraine is going to pay back these loans, well, I have a bridge to sell you. That's all I can say about it. So it's again, the old man, he's out of touch. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's triggered this huge inflation crisis. He's making that inflation crisis worse. He's got all of these strange people around him who want to involve the United States in ever more conflicts. We did a program, Alex and I, earlier today about these changes in, the website, the State Department website over Taiwan. I mean, whatever you may think of that, I mean, is this the right time now to be riling up China and to be dragging us into some kind of conflict over Taiwan when, Ukraine is not settled? And of course, we also have policies in the United States itself that seem to me to be increasingly irrelevant to America's problems, which this administration is not making worse. It is making exponentially worse. And you have simultaneously with all of this in Europe, European governments who seem to be in competition with each other as to who is going to do the most damage in the European economy. And we were talking again about the oil import ban, which Ursula von der Leyen seems to be obsessed with imposing on Europe. There's been some pushback from some of the East European states, and Hungary's holding out, but sooner or later, I think it's going to come. Except, of course, as Alex and I also discussed earlier today, we now heard that the Greek ship owners have been able to claw out a provision that they could continue to ship Russian oil. Now, I worked on the fringes, the far fringes of the Greek shipping world, and I have known in my time lots of ship owners, and I've talked to them about what I know what they did during with Iran sanctions and the Iraq sanctions. I tell you what's going to happen. They're going to be stocking, piling up their oil tankers with Russian oil, shipping it from Vladivostok. The oil tanker will go around the world. There'll be all kinds of documents created, and you're probably better at knowing about how this is done than I am, Robert. But I know it is done, creating a whole sort of history for this oil. And of course, eventually, where will it end up? It will end up in Europe. But we will be paying through the nose for it because all the middlemen who laundered it will have their cuts.
No doubt. I mean, I think two things there in terms of the shipping aspect. I mean, some of that's already happening. As long as it's 49% Russian oil, it's not considered Russian oil, apparently, under the sanctions list. So you have people just, dumping it into other barrels and boom. Of course, what somebody smart will do is what you're mentioning. They'll just change the label. I had a case years ago where someone was supposed to be in the business of providing very quick, critical supplies that were from specific makers of those supplies. And they were from Asia, and the China and Southeast Asia concept of intellectual property, let's say, isn't always exactly the same as it is in America. And they sat there and like, why would you go and get this specific part? I'll just go and get a generic version and stick the label on it. And there's a wide range of issues of that, RICO, fraud, etc. But that's what they were doing. They were just sticking the label on it, got a major competitive advantage. They figured, I'll just print the labels. Why get the parts? Just get a generic substitute. And so that dynamic is going to happen. I mean, basically, you're right. All it's going to do is jack up the price, and you're going to pay a smuggler's tax now. And that's it. Now, in terms of land, and that's why it's all for naught. And of course, as long as the oil price is going up in general, commodity price, I mean, Russia's and still net profiting. Russia's economy grew in the first quarter this year. The American economy shrank in the first quarter, which was not supposed to happen, of course. Definitely not supposed to happen with the sanctions. But the second aspect is Lend-Lease. I mean, it's classic of us. I mean, this was FDR's way to get around directly helping in World War One. World War II. And even though he was also involved in World War One, but indirectly while he was at the Navy, sinking the Lusitania, another story there. But the was that, hey, we're not really getting involved in the war. We're actually just doing something that'll be profitable for us over time. I mean, it took the Brits and the Russians 60 years to pay back the Lend-Lease. And those countries were countries that were in a position to pay it back. As you note, Ukraine will not be, especially if Ukraine is a rump state at the end of this. If all of their richest agricultural land, their strongest industrial land, their most resource-rich land, the land that has access to the ports and the seas, is all gone, which appears to be a likely outcome of this war if it continues at the pace it does currently, there's no way they're paying back that money. This was the poorest economy in Europe to begin with, one of the poorest economies in the world to begin with. And now you take away their agricultural land. You take away, I mean, it's not just that from Kharkov all the way down to Odessa. Not only is that the historical 1922 areas that was added officially to the then existing Ukraine, hence Putin's reference to, I'm going to decommunize your borders for you, since you don't like you blame the Soviets for everything. Well, I'll show you what that looks like. But it's also, you look at it as a map of where are the wheat fields, where's the agricultural wealth, where's the rich farmland, where's the natural gas or oil deposits to the degree they exist there, where's other resources, where are their great factories, where are their big industry. It's all in that same region. Overall, I mean, there's a little bit in the West, but not a lot. And then, of course, that's the part that Poland already has Polish TV on the other day showing, hey, let's see what this looks like, bringing back the old Western section back in to the Polish, where it was, associated with the Polish-Lithuanian Empire. They thought of it as under Ruthenian lords and whatnot, going back to the Kievan Rus and the local population, but has been affiliated on the global maps as part of Poland or the Polish-Lithuanian Empire going way, way, way back. So I think that given that the Lend-Lease has almost no chance of being paid back. So it is just a way to pretend you're not directly just spending more money on a country than you already are. It will be interesting to watch the vote on the $40 billion. So there's two things that they do with all these bills in the states. So they're in the $40 billion. How much of it actually goes to Ukraine is an interesting question. Because they stick in order to get everybody's votes and on board, they stick in everybody's little pet project. So somehow somebody's bridge project in rural Pennsylvania is part of aid to Ukraine, that kind of thing. So there'll be a bunch of what they call pork here loosely in the United States, padded in there in order to get as many votes. But they assume it would pass with ease because the sanctions vote, only 8 members of the House opposed it, 6 Republicans, 2 Democrats. Nobody in the Senate opposed it. It was 100-0, like your Gulf of Tonkin type vote. And now the 6 Republicans that voted against it were the 6 Republicans the one Libertarian, Thomas Massey, and then the 5 that are the closest to the base: Paul Gosar, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, Madison Cawthorn, in particular, those 4. All 3 of those 4 were then targeted to be removed from the ballot on the grounds that they supported the insurrection and all this gibberish. All those efforts have failed, but they still faced a consequence. Madison Cawthorn had the Republican Party hierarchy in his own state come after him. Both Senator Tom Tillis, a corrupt hack, and Senator Burr, who, by the way, is under investigation because he and his brother were engaged in illegal trading using inside information on the pandemic. He's under criminal investigation in New York currently. That's who these guys are, but they're political hacks. Burr's Senate Intelligence Committee, which is basically run by the Intelligence Committee. It was created by Frank Church to govern the Intelligence Committee. It's been hijacked by the Intelligence Committee to govern the Senate. But so that gives you an idea that they came after him, but they haven't budged on their positions. And their positions have become that populist position has become more and more popular within the Republican base, especially. The only two Democrats, the entire anti-war Democratic Congressional Caucus is made of two pro-Palestinian congressmen. That's it right now. Ilhan Omar and Rashid Tlaib. That's it. They're the only ones to vote against sanctions, which is pitiful. Really sad that where the Democratic Party anti-war base has gone. That doesn't mean it's not there in the popular vote, but there's this gap between the elected representatives and the ordinary people, what they want, especially on issues like war. I mean, there always has been in America. It's a weakness of representational government that those individuals can be co-opted or they can represent a class interest that's different than the people they're representing, et cetera. But on war and deep state politics has been particularly bad. Now, when we last talked, we said that I mentioned that one of the big real referendums on the popularity of the war would be the primary of J.D. Vance in Ohio. And I talked to J.D. Vance when he was making his decision on all of this. Talked to him for over an hour. And ultimately, Vance's thought was, you know what? I'm only running to make a difference. And the politicians' crime is they get so obsessed that they have to win in order to make a difference that they start only caring about winning and quit figuring out why they ran in the first place. He's like, I don't want to make that mistake. So, but he was saying, look, he goes, I'm going to have deep state people come after me, the entire apparatus. The donors are going to cut me off. There's going to be money spent against me as soon as I make my stand public. I'm going to have the media institutions, Murdoch's engines come after me. I'm going to have all of this to deal with. But you know, I think it, and he was curious, how did I think it was going to play out? And the predictions that both of you have been making have been accurate pretty much all the way through. And that ended up being valuable, because if you're someone like a J.D. Vance, and I talked to other elected representatives, other people seeking office, if your predictions are accurate over a 15, 30, 45-day period, that helps a lot with their confidence in saying, okay, I can take this path. And I know it may be a popular path with voters, but it's an unpopular path with powerful people and institutional actors. But if those institutional actors' narratives are wrong consistently, then I can have more confidence in in what's taking place. J.D. Vance went up. At the time, he was fourth or fifth in the polls, single digits, went on a debate stage. But his key opponents all said they would support a no-fly zone and whatever else it took to help Ukraine. He said absolutely not. Won't support a no-fly zone, won't support intervention, won't support sanctions, we have no business. Ukraine can worry about Ukraine's borders. We need to worry about America's borders. And he surged until the point he was tied with first. Now the Wall Street Journal wrote a hit piece on him. Politico wrote a hit piece on him. The key donors said, we're not going to give you another penny, nickel, dime, or dollar. Big money came in from the corporate, the Chamber of Commerce and other sort of, what's called dark money here in America, money that you don't find out about until after the election as to who it came from. Tens of millions of dollars were spent against him. And he still surged. And Trump was watching. Donald Trump Jr. was watching. Trump put out his statement. That's the only statement he's made about Ukraine now in a while, which was, we need peace now. So much so that Noam Chomsky came out and said the only person who has a reasonable position, and Chomsky had an intense Trump, TDS, said is Donald Trump, is the only one who has a reasonable position of stature in the West. And then Donald Trump Jr. made a very big anti-war speech with J.D. Vance in Ohio. And what happens? J.D. Vance not only wins, he exceeds all the betting market edges in terms of the probability of victory, in terms of the margin of victory, almost won by double digits. In fact, for the first time ever, the Democratic vote in northeastern Ohio, which is sort of working class industrial heartland of America, more people voted in the Republican primary than voted in the Democratic primary for the first time in a century in those two counties. And that was with a Democratic candidate for the Senate who's from that region on the ballot, and Tim Ryan, who briefly ran for the presidency. And so Vance is going to win in Ohio big. And so we've seen a test of what the ordinary, everyday Republican populist wing thinks. Yeah. Same throughout large parts of the country. The gap is the institutional influence of the deep state in the media, in the think tanks, in the academies, in the donor class is still very, very strong. Now, what helps JD Vance is increasingly in America, you can raise money without the donor class controlling it. The technological revolution of being able to do mass crowdsourced funding has revolutionized. That's why Bernie Sanders went from a gadfly to a serious player, solely because of the technological capabilities of a small donor in terms of amounts, but broad support transferring power away from the donor class as a gatekeeper into who could run for significant office. As well, the rise of the independent media. The rise of the independent media has the kind of people supporting JD Vance in the social media space. And like when Politico was trying to understand how did this happen, because couldn't have been because of his anti-war position, because everybody knows that's not popular. Wisdom of Politico, of course, they attributed in part to social media success, but that social media success came because that's where the anti-war base of the Republican populist wing of the party has strong influence. They're able to reach a wide range of people through not only social media but independent internet sites, whether it's your Gateway Pundit or a Western Conservative Review, things probably nobody's ever heard of, but that are read more than the New York Times amongst Republican conservative populists. And once again, the guy who was the predictor of all of this, the canary in the coal mine as to where the Republican populist base was going to go, was a guy they don't pay much attention to, but their polling shows more conservatives trust than the New York Times, and that was Alexander Emmerich Jones out of Austin, Texas. A guy that the snobs love to sneer at still continues to be the best predictor of where the populist Republican base is going. And that is he was anti-war from day one. I mean, he went on this long cussing routine about all of these people, about they just trying to get us in a nuclear war, and this is insanity, and The public opinion polling is Patrick Basham's for the Express there in the UK published. This is a guy who's ahead of the curve on Brexit, accurate in 2016, much more accurate in 2020 than in the States than the institutional American press. Just behind Richard Barris, the People's Pundit, who's consistently the best pollster in the United States. And what did he find? He found that, that you can't get more than 20% support for any action in Ukraine in the United States that could lead to war with Russia. They're just not interested. And not only that, this is my favorite part of the poll. He asked Americans, if you had a choice, who do you think should step down first? Vladimir Putin from Russia or Joe Biden from the United States? A majority chose Joe Biden from the United States. A majority of Americans said Joe Biden should step down from the White House. Can you imagine if that poll was done 1940 and they said FDR or Adolf Hitler? I mean, do you imagine by double digits they would pick FDR stepping down before Hitler? And so you get that dynamic. That's how embarrassing it is. Their effort in the court of public opinion in the United States has failed because the war is not popular. Further intervention is not popular. Biden's still underwater on every meaningful measurement. On Ukraine and on foreign policy, he's just as underwater as he is on everything else. So this is not. There's a misleading impression created by the media monopoly preaching propaganda on the war. You not only have ABC, CBS, NBC, MSNBC, and CNN all preaching for the war. You have most of Fox, everybody but Tucker, preaching for the war at Fox News. And the whole Murdoch machine, this is an Aussie. He's not an American, but that's another story for another day. With his New York Post, Wall Street Journal, and Fox pushing a war propaganda. New York Post has put out some of the dumbest lies about the war of any newspaper in the States. It's almost to the level of British coverage. We still aren't there. British coverage is still the most insane coverage I've ever read. And my favorite one, latest one, was they tracked where Ukrainian refugees were going in Russia. And they told the story as if Russia's kidnapping all of these Ukrainians and putting them in quasi-concentration camps throughout. It's like, how do you take them helping massive refugees to the locations where they can actually absorb them and provide them housing and shelter and support and translate that into mass kidnapping into concentration camps? It's like, how do you get from, it's extraordinary. But that's the British press. New York Post is the closest to that in the States, and it's because of Rupert Murdoch. That's his Sky News coverage is atrocious in Australia and his other coverage as well in the UK. It's not quite that bad in the States, but it's revelations. But the bottom line is they don't have the support to do any more military action. And that's why I'll be curious how much they still have a lot of institutional control for something like a budget vote. And again, it's saddled with pork that's going to somebody's buddy on the entire in the House and the Senate. But if that number grows by more than the people who voted against the sanctions, then they're in trouble if it just grows at all. Because generally there's a fear factor up on the Hill. There's a reason why there was only one senator to vote against the Patriot Act, to challenge the deep state directly on a position the ordinary American doesn't have that much stake in. It's $40 billion. It's $40 billion. It's but on the U.S. budgetary side, it's a couple of days. So it's big for Ukraine. It's not so big for the U.S. But I guarantee it'll be unpopular. Foreign aid has never been popular in the United States. Doesn't matter who it's to. I mean, outside of like hurricanes and earthquakes, those kind of things. Yeah, if you ask the American people, are you for $40 billion going to Ukraine, you're going to get 2/3 no. And in particular, in the Democratic Party, who's opposed to this further intervention of the war is the exact voter groups they need to have turn out in the midterms. Black voters, Hispanic voters, and younger voters, but particularly African-American and Latino. That's the Quinnipiac poll showed. That was the big group that was like, not interested in any further involvement in this war. Not surprisingly, disproportionately represented in the armed services and part of the working class community within the Democratic base. It'll be interesting to see. I think the bill will still pass. I'm just curious if it gets more than 20, more than 30, more than 40. How many people oppose it? Because that will be the sign that they're just like the UN vote a month ago or so. They have been losing ground politically here in the United States to support further action in Ukraine, not gaining ground.
They're losing ground in Europe as well, actually. I mean, I've been seeing some polling in Germany, and where polling was overwhelmingly in support of intervention a few weeks ago with the change in economic conditions in Germany, it's now about 50-50. So that's actually quite a big shift in opinion in Germany. Robert, you sent us some time ago some absolutely eye-watering polling statistics for the midterms. I mean, I'm always interested in the midterms because I sometimes think that what happens in America in the midterms is more important. It has a bigger impact in Europe than it does in America itself, in the sense that I sometimes get the sense that the midterms in America, well, they're just the midterms. I mean, you have midterms, Congress is always changing, but in Europe, remember, we are, or we like to act as if we are, your satellites, your vassals, if you like. So we always have to see what's going on in the capital, where the king is, if you like, what's happening there. So people always follow the midterms. In the political class, certainly in Britain, follows the midterms very, very closely. And I'm going to say this: if the results are as you say, there's going to be, certainly in Britain, a big shock if we have the kind of shift to the Republicans that you see in the US in the midterms. British elite opinion is going to be extremely nervous about what that means, because what has happened in Britain, and I think elsewhere in Europe, is that when the administration, when Biden came in, there was this, surge of relief. We've got somebody we can work with again. Trump is behind us. We don't have to worry about him anymore. This is somebody who's, we know well, who's really, shares our views on every subject. And my God, now it's turning out that he's unpopular. And it looks as if all these people from the backwoods that in America who we don't really know much about, but who we're very nervous of, that they're coming back to the foreground again. And that might have an important effect on the way policy works out in Europe too. So what is going to happen in the midterms? Is it going to be as that opinion poll that you sent us suggests?
Yeah, so Patrick Basham's expectations is that Republicans gain 70 or more seats in the House and have one of the biggest margins they've ever had in the House of Representatives since at least the 1920s. And that you're going to have 5 or 6 Senate seats picked up so that Republicans will have a solid, 10-seat or so margin in the U.S. Senate. and then similar, 50, 60 massive margin in the House. It will also be the most populous in the Republican caucus in the House and the Senate since the 1920s. I mean, there hasn't been, like I said, the Rand Paul is the closest you get on war issues, and even he hasn't pushed back consistently on the Russia narrative. Whereas you're probably looking at J.D. Vance, Eric Greitens out of Missouri, Blake Masters out of Arizona, Adam Laxalt out of Nevada. All of them have either refused to make any big pro go to war statements or explicit Trumpish we shouldn't be involved statements. And that, so you'll have the biggest, most populist in the Senate since the 1920s on issues of war and foreign conflict. We're still a ways away from the Senate reflecting American public opinion on it, but it would be a lot closer to it. So right now, it would be an absolute disaster. Biden is the most unpopular president, polling-wise, for a Democratic president in the history of polling in America. He is trolling near the depths at which Nixon was during Watergate, at which at various points Poppy Bush was towards the very end, and George W. Bush was after the disaster of the combination of the war and bailouts in 2008. And Biden is almost a very comparable to W. W was getting us involved in dumb foreign entanglements that had turned deeply unpopular, and at the same time was having a disastrous economy that he was mishandling and mismanaging and bailing out the protected privileged classes to such a degree that Democrats had their sweep in 2006 in the House and the Senate, and then in the White House in 2008. They just didn't offer a viable alternative because neoliberalism was no more attractive than neoconservatism to the ordinary average American worker, economically or geopolitically. And so, right now it's going to be a bloodbath on par with 1994, and probably worse. I mean, Clinton was just unpopular due to some cultural issues. The economy wasn't that bad in 1994. He wasn't entangling us in another dumb European war, especially. I mean, the whole America was founded on, please, no more dumb European war involvement. To make it Europe is bad. I thought Biden would get us involved in an African war, Ethiopia, someplace like that, justify it as, hey, we're stopping the second Rwanda and all that kind of routine. To get a Ukraine, that's one of the dumbest places to get us involved in a war. The deep state should have thought ahead, not China, not Russia. Don't make that your adversary, make some tiny little tin can country in Africa, your army in Africa, your enemy. But nope, we had to go big. And so you look at this aggregate, right now it's a disaster. Like there's all these memes going around that, how do you get to 81 million or 81 million votes for Biden or 81? You add 33% job approval, 40 billion to Ukraine, and the increase in the inflation rate of 8%, and boom, you got 81. So, it's stuff like that. So this is a guy that's persona non grata. But they have no alternative. Kamala Harris is even more unpopular. Trump Trump is, for the first time in his political career, back to getting favorable approval ratings in some surveys, which he had never had the entire time. His personal approval rating was always underwater, even when he was tied in the polls. And usually he was he was almost always way behind in the polls. The polls just exaggerated his deficit. But now some of those same polls have him ahead. And what that means is you're talking about Ronald Reagan 1980 kind of landslide is what would happen if the presidential election was held today, was reheld today between Trump and Biden. So you're looking at a massive Democratic wipeout in the midterms unless something radical changes. And that's probably what makes it so dangerous at the moment. Because the most logical place for them to change the narrative, for them to shift the script, for them to dramatically move. Well, look at American history. When has America got involved in foreign entanglements? Remember the Maine, the hell with Spain, the sinking of the Maine in the Havana Harbor, 1898, Spanish-American War. There were certain elements that wanted, to from a dying, decaying Spanish Empire, steal those territories from Puerto Rico to the Philippines, but they needed a pretext. The pretext was an attack on America. Then the sinking of the Lusitania didn't immediately result in World War I. Indeed, Woodrow Wilson said, he ran in 1916, I kept you out of war. That was his winning slogan. Well, a year later, dragged us right into it. But they used the attack on the Lusitania, which they misrepresented the facts concerning, to be, hey, the Germans attacked us first. We got to go in. Then World War II, of course, the attack on Pearl Harbor was the justification for our entry, even though you can research the history of that as to how much FDR did or didn't do things to prevent that from occurring. Then you have, Korean War. There was an attack on South Korea where U.S. soldiers were located at the time. Vietnam War, Gulf of Tonkin. Look at these terrible Viet Cong. They've attacked our poor little ships sitting in the harbor. Of course, there were no attacks on August 4th that night. The attack happened 2 days before when we were up helping the South Vietnamese raid the North Vietnamese waters, and we weren't in international waters. We were in North Vietnamese waters. But, that's a story that only came out long after the vote had been taken. But again, attack on America, justification for entry to war. The Afghanistan war, of course, we use that as 9/11 as the basis for that. We use 9/11 again because, hey, if you got one script, why not use it twice to go into Iraq the second time? Mm. And so if you look at what would they need to enter the NATO, to get in, to put troops on the ground, because I agree with what you said the other day, Alexander. They've lost the political war. They've lost the economic war. The only way NATO wins the war against this proxy war against Russia and Ukraine is boots on the ground, NATO boots on the ground. They need trained soldiers, trained professionals, trained pilots to be able to equal the balance of power, or they're weeks away from the Ukrainian army collapsing in the eastern part of Ukraine, and then nothing to stop Russia from saying, let's go ahead and add Odessa and return her to Elizabeth's homeland. I think I was going to say, didn't he actually even cite Elizabeth in his speech? He made some reference. Maybe it was a second speech that he made, but that dynamic, that's the risk. And I think the only way that happens, though, it would help in Democrats' mind, they're in a no-lose situation. Right now, they're going to get crushed anyway. What could possibly reverse the script? A global war. A global war that reportrays Biden as the adult in the room. Turns out he's the adult with a diaper, but that's what it is. But put that back into the public narrative, shift the story framework. It helped W. W was sinking in 2001 before 9/11 in Iraq. That led him to resurge and do well in 2002 and win in hold power in 2004. I don't think they're right about how that would play out politically, but at this point, if you're them, isn't it? It's almost your only option. You're going to get crushed otherwise. You could try to bring back another pandemic, and Bill Gates is talking about how magically another more dangerous pandemic will show up on the scene, and try to lock down again and try to do mass mail-in voting. But you have movies like 2000 Mules that Fox won't talk about, but the Dinesh D'Souza's film, which is just about how the 2000 election fornication rather than fortification, I do like that word, took place. There was a lot of fornicating in the 2000 election. In terms of what people did, I don't think they'll be able to recreate that, even if they did try to reintroduce a pandemic. So what does that leave? A foreign war. And how do you get Americans involved in a foreign war? You need an attack on the United States. You need, or at least something they can call an attack on the United States. How well they could pull off a false flag? Deep State's not as good at this as they used to be, in my opinion. So far, the Ukraine has been a joke. I get they show a video of their own helicopter going down over Snake Island when they tried to seize it the day before, Victory Day. And they tell everybody, look, we shot down the Russian helicopter over Snake Island, when it makes no sense why there would even be a Russian helicopter over Snake Island. They're not as skilled and gifted and capable, I think, as in the past. But I think that we're at maximum risk for that. I also think it's why they keep poking the Russian bear. They want Putin to do something, to do some direct attack on at least a NATO country, if not the U.S. Do something that we can really make a deal. They don't think the false flags haven't worked. Americans just like, okay, fine, bad people over there in Ukraine, not our problem, not our issue. They need an attack on the United States to justify further intervention, to try to shift this narrative, to try to salvage and save the midterms for the Democratic Party, or at least stem the bleeding that they're going to have. Because right now they would lose not only the House and the Senate, they would lose state legislatures and governorships in all the key states leading up to 2024. It's important to remember in 2018, the Democratic Party grabbed the governorships of Michigan, grabbed the governorships of Wisconsin, grabbed the governorships of Pennsylvania, and that helped them set the election rules that helped determine the presidential outcome. Right now, Republicans are going to get the governorships of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, while holding in Georgia and Arizona and Florida. That puts them, and they would not have Republicans would control the state legislatures of all those states, which means they can write their own election rules for 2024. So this is why they're panicking and paranoid and desperate, and that creates a very dangerous government and a dangerous policy to be on high alert for. And it's why, I mean, why are they escalating in Transnistria, doing attacks on Russia, direct inside the territory of Russia, doing things like threats, bragging in the New York Times about how we're getting Russian generals killed, bragging in the New York Times about how we sunk a Russian ship. Now, some of those were exaggerated statements anyway. There haven't been as many. All these generals ended up showing up the next day that got killed. And some of these, the Moskva ultimately sunk, but not in the way that was said. But the other frigate, they said that was sunk, showed up in the port the next day. So it's like, well, I don't know how about this working. But this mindset, this mentality, why do that? Normally, the U.S. wouldn't be doing. I mean, we went nuts when the deep state spread a false story about Russians putting bounties on U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. Here we're bragging in the New York Times of whacking Russian generals, even though that story is mostly not true, in the sense of not many generals have actually been killed that there's proof of. It still tells you the mindset that there's people in the Biden administration. Now, the Pentagon was unhappy with that. The next day, the Pentagon officially said, no, we have nothing to do with this. This isn't true. But doesn't change the fact that somebody in the deep state's leaking to New York, and it's all to poke them. I mean, it's like let's on Victory Day, no less, have the Russian ambassador to Poland, drenched in red paint or whatever it was. That kind of thing doesn't happen by accident or coincidence in my book. And again, it's just meant to poke them. How many times can we insult, upset? You see it. It works to a certain degree, like Russians with Attitude, a very popular podcast and Twitter account, a lot of good, interesting intel and information, big historical. And this is someone that's more restrained on the Russian side of the equation, was complaining just 2 days ago, why isn't Russia doing something in response to all this European and U.S. provocation? Because I think Putin understands this is the only way the U.S. can justify getting troops on the ground. And if it isn't U.S. troops, I mean, God bless all these European countries, but when's the last time anybody in Europe won a war without America? I mean, just honestly, God, truth. That's like you always say about the French. They should just learn to say "Merci, monsieur" and move on. I mean, the only reason why they're not speaking German is because we stepped in twice. So how much? And do we really want German soldiers wandering around Europe? Is that such a great idea? Does that imagery make you feel better? I think without U.S. involvement, the ability of NATO to go in unilaterally is limited. I know the Brits are talking about it. I mean, the British press is like, oh, hey, we can do it ourselves. We go in and whoop those Ruskies all by ourselves. Good luck with that. That's why you had Russian TV stations talking about maybe we'll induce a tsunami and see what Britain looks like underwater. I mean, that kind of talk is not helpful talk, but it shows where the mindset is going. But so loosely, that's I think there's a massive effort amongst the deep state here in the United States to provoke Russia or to create a false flag event that it looks like a Russian attack on America, because it's the only way they get actually boots on the ground. And unless they get boots on the ground, Russia's going to win the Ukraine war in 30 to 60 days.
I completely agree. I completely agree with every point. Now, can I just say on Britain taking on the Russians single-handed without the US, when we went into Iraq, we needed the US military to come and rescue our troops who'd got themselves into a terrible mess in Basra. The US had to come and rescue them. And exactly the same thing happened when British troops were fighting in Afghanistan in Helmand province. Again, the US had to come in and rescue them. I mean, one of the things that really exasperates me is listening to the British, especially the British. The British are particularly bad at this, and say, we've got the best army. We're far better than the Americans. We can do this all by ourselves. We don't really need the Americans. The facts, the record shows otherwise. We haven't fought a successful war without American help since before the First World War. Ever since that war, the First World War, we've always needed American help in every conflict, and that is the reality. And our dependence is getting bigger. I mean, the Falklands being another case in point. I mean, we could not have succeeded in the Falklands War in 1982 if the United States had not come to our rescue and provided us with intelligence and equipment and ammunition and all kinds of things which were not admitted to or acknowledged at the time. But I just wanted to say the administration is very well aware of the military realities in Ukraine. Now, Robert, you're absolutely right. We have the worst media, I think, in the Western world here in Britain. I mean, if we're talking about Ukraine and the war there, I mean, you will not find any reference anywhere in the British media, for example, to events like the Battle of Popasnaya, the Battle of Snake Island, or anything like that. If it's a question of Ukrainian defeats, we don't mention them. We talk about always about Ukrainian victories. But there is one newspaper which, because it writes for the business community, every so often does give out glimmers of reality. So I was reading a few hours ago that the director of national intelligence in the United States, Avril Haines, has now gone before Congress. And this is in the Financial Times. And Avril Haines is said to have told Congress, Russia wants to consolidate control of the land bridge it has established from Crimea to Donbass, occupy Kherson, control the water sources for Crimea. And she also says that Putin's immediate aims were to capture the Donetsk and Lugansk regions with a buffer zone and encircle Ukrainian forces from the north, south, and to the west of the Donbass to crush the most capable and well-equipped Ukrainian forces. And then she goes on to say, I'm quoting from the Financial Times, Russia may be capable of achieving most of these near-term goals. Now, obviously, she uses the word may, and that might be editing by the Financial Times, but you will never see that in any other British newspaper. None of them accept the fact that Russia is achieving its objectives in eastern Ukraine. Now, Haines said an awful lot of other things, and I'm not going to waste time about them. But the fact is, the administration is being briefed by its intelligence agencies about the realities of what is actually happening in Ukraine. And I think they've got themselves into a position now where the economy is going to pieces in the United States. Well, I mean, I'm exaggerating, I'm overstating it, but we have very high inflation. We have supply issue problems. We're going to have all kinds of mounting problems in the economy over the next couple of months. As you rightly say, in the first quarter, it actually contracted. Remember, the fastest economic growth in the world. This is what we were hearing about a year ago. It hasn't turned out like that at all. Remember the transitory inflation? That hasn't turned out either. So if we have a situation where the economy is going wrong, where everything that the administration does turns to dust, where Biden is the president with a non-Midas touch because everything he touches goes wrong. And on top of that, we have a failed war in Ukraine, a war which the people we are supporting to the tune of tens of billions of dollars look like they're going to lose. And this, of course, a year after the Afghanistan debacle. Well, I think the pressure to intervene is going to become overwhelming. And it's exactly what you said. They're trying to goad the Russians into doing something stupid or unwise in order to justify some bigger intervention by the United States, by its allies in Ukraine. But it won't be. It won't work, and it can't even conceivably work without the US being physically there. I mean, I'm going to say, whatever the brave words the British may come up with, no NATO country is going to put boots in Ukraine, except possibly Poland, unless it has the physical support of the United States, because all of them know, between them, all of them know. The French know it, the British know it, the Germans, who spent the whole Afghan conflict when they had their troops in Afghanistan, all their troops spent all their time inside their camps. They never ventured outside. All of them know it, that if they went into a battle in Ukraine against the Russians, they would be smashed even faster probably than the Ukrainians are. So it's not going. They're not going to do it. They want the US. If they're going to go in, they will want the US to go in, and the political imperative to do it is, I think, getting stronger. It's getting stronger both in Ukrainian terms because of the conflict, the direction of the conflict there. It's because everything else is failing. So how do you rescue this disastrous situation? You intervene and keep your fingers crossed and hope that Putin is bluffing. Though, of course, as we've seen repeatedly, Putin never bluffs.
No doubt. And I mean, and there's a history of it here in the States in the sense of trying to prop up other countries' armies just doesn't have sustained success. We did it in South Korea. It took North Korea like a couple of days to basically take it out. We had to intervene to push them back to the border. And then when China got involved, the border was back to frozen. Then we did it again with South Vietnam. Of course, that didn't work out so well. Did it again in Afghanistan. That didn't work out so well. Did it in Iraq. That didn't work out so well. Tried it in Syria, though there was some interesting groups we were backing there. That didn't turn out so well. So there's really no reason to believe backing. I think they really thought, I think they primarily thought we're going to win the economic war. We control the global financial system. It's an interdependent system. Everybody's dependent on us at the global financial level. And it goes back to that 1997 debate between Putin's graduate paper thesis and your George Soros at the time about what controls economic power going forward. And Putin's thesis was having control of resources is what matters. You put on the survival pyramid, at the very core of it, at the very foundation of it is fuel and food. Control fuel and food, you don't have to worry about the rest. You can restore, you have the ultimate power because you have what people need to survive. Not necessarily what they would like to thrive, but what they need to survive. And he's turned out right. His premise was right. The EU, the globalist environment, the George Soros's, that crowd was wrong about how sanctions would functionally work and who really controls what is real economic wealth. Real economic wealth is food and fuel. And then secondly, it's making stuff. Last, it's being a big consumer of things, which is what the West is, because the West has only punished and penalized itself so far, and that's the only path it's going in. So they know by this point they're not going to win the economic war. There's still delusional talk here, like all the geopolitical approved channels on YouTube will still say stuff like, "Oh, this is manipulating the currency." I always find that funny. The central bank manipulating the currency, and that's only Russia that does that. What do you think the Fed is? What do you think the ECB is? Why do you think they have negative interest rates for the last half decade? What do you think the central bank of Japan is? But the bottom line is we tried to manipulate their currency in a different direction and it failed. So they're able to maintain it, sustain it. It's up to the highest level it's been in several years now. And it can still float within a good range and they'll be just fine. And then the other point we made early on was domestic inflation wasn't going to happen in Russia. I remember talking to J.D. Vance and others. Here's why the sanctions plan won't work and why you don't want to be invested on the globalist side of this equation, because this is what's going to happen on just the economic side. And they've seen it. They got to witness it. That Joe Biden famously said from this stage, the ruble is rubble. Well, that's some good rubble to have if you can get your hands on it. It's doubled in value since he said that. So it's just one dumb statement by the rest. But domestic inflation didn't happen in Russia because 90% of the core things they need, food and fuel, and the fuel goes into rent, and the fuel goes into manufactured goods domestically. It goes into so many other things as a key cost component. It didn't go up because they have their own food, their own fuel, and their own fertilizer. So consequently, the ordinary Russian, like I follow, there's a channel called like Survival Russian. It's this guy way out in East. So I say people from Russia are like people from East Tennessee. It's amazing how comparable they are value-wise. But, he's out in East. He's making like random stuff to survive and how you can, stay in a tent when it's 40 degrees below zero and, still feed yourself, all this kind of stuff. But he's been tracking what inflation is like for people in rural Russia. And he's like, basically nothing's changed. A few fancy Western goods are more expensive. That's kind of it. You know, the Coca-Cola is more expensive. This coffee I like from Italy is more expensive. That's about all. Nothing else has really budged for the ordinary Russian, because the things that, unlike the United States, and unlike most of Europe for sure, the key essential ingredients are ingredients in Russia they make themselves. So the economic war is never going to work. The political war is, like, for all of Russia's screw ups in terms of the propaganda war in the West, there's an argument that their failure to engage in propaganda has actually helped them in the global South. That because Ukraine puts out one dumb fake story after the next dumb fake story, goes to Kiev, Snake Island, try to claim certain things about certain events in a suburb of Kiev that appear to be refuted by later evidence. That they were being shelled, and that these people died when they were being shelled, and they were being shelled while Russia controlled the town, and Russia wasn't shelling itself. Just like Epstein didn't Epstein himself, Russia didn't shell itself. And so they're not winning the political war. And the opinion is hardening against the West in China, in India, in Brazil. Lulu came out and said, whether it's Bolsonaro or Lulu, it came out and said, look at the Zelensky guy. He's on TV from noon to midnight. It's like, this guy's not serious. This guy's not a serious leader to respect. You bringing in you too? It's like, these are things that might do well with your millennial TikTok audience in Paris or in New York. It does not do well amongst your respected political leader in Brazil or in India or in Mexico. I mean, we've lost Mexico, Brazil, Indonesia, India, 4 of the biggest countries that are supposed to be aligned with us. Even Japan is trying to figure out ways to walk back some of the sanctions and keep some of their relationships because they can't afford economically to do what's happening. So given that environment, politics isn't going to work. All the cancellation just makes us look like idiots, canceling trees and cats, and along with chess players and tennis players. It is embarrassing of the United States. A federal judge actually cited the Snake Island case in a sanctions case against a Russian here, said, look at the great people of Snake Island and how they stood up to the Ruskies. I mean, when the Ruskies came up, they said, yeah, we'll be right here to surrender. Well, where do we go? It wasn't FU and all that nonsense. So there's nothing about the Ukrainian army, given our history, that suggests that it would succeed militarily. But I think some people in the West convinced themselves it would. This is the same group that was telling everybody that the Afghan army was going to whoop the Taliban right before they were running for the planes and jumping on the last thing to get out of town with whatever money they could stuff in the bag from the West to get out of there. The Ukraine army is, you're seeing more and more. You guys have talked about it. 40-year-olds, 45-year-olds, 50-year-olds. It's like, what are these people doing? You get whole units that will randomly surrender on a given day, saying, look, this is a bunch of crap. We've been screwed. We've been lied to. We're not getting the support we need. You see the Canadian sniper who, the greatest sniper in the world, and he's like, I'm out of here. He was there for like a week. That there's an American mercenary that he still wants to go back because he thinks it's all Call of Duty on meth. But he was saying, it's pretty bad every day. Basically, you just get bombed and shelled into, how you could stay. It's like living World War I in the trenches for the Ukrainian army. Just hit and hit and hit. They're not making any gains. And as you said, Alexander, what tends to happen is it's slow, and then bam, and slow, and then bam. And that's what we saw. We're seeing when towns collapse, they suddenly collapse. When the Ukrainian army falls apart, it suddenly falls apart, and it's running into the trees and in the woods. And so I think militarily, they can't sustain themselves. Even if we get weapons there, we have problems getting weapons to the front line. Even if because of they're hitting they're now hitting the railroad stations, they're hitting the bridges, they're hitting the depots. And even if we get them there, we have weapons that much of which they're not trained on. And that would take some time for them to use while they're having draft protests in parts of Ukraine over what's taking place, of dragging these old guys to the front line who don't have military experience and expertise. And the inferiority both in the air and with munitions is a problem in terms of artillery, missiles and bombs especially, but not limited to that. The Russians just have better weapons, period. And it's a war of attrition, a deep battle policy, like we talked about from the very inception. It was never meant to take the country in 72 hours. That was, I think, what you're seeing, what you cite there from our Office of Director of National Intelligence, who brings all the intelligence together. It was Clapper's position for a period of time in the past when he was busy perjuring to Congress that led to Snowden. The is that they never believed. Nobody inside the Pentagon believed what Milley was publicly preaching, that Russia thought they were going to collapse Ukraine in 72 hours. A lot of this, but it's fascinating. You get these OSINT guys on social media, all these military experts in the think tanks and whatnot. And the problem is they're just getting embarrassed on a daily basis because they predict things or explain things that then are countered the very next day. And I mean, these are people who believed in goes to Kiev, like the New York Post did, who believe that Snake Island happened the way it did, who believe that, both times, believe that they really didn't, they fought to the death the first time, and the second time they took it back and just whooped the Ruskies. Clearly, that was an attempt to embarrass Russia. One thing I'm telling everybody is that confession through projection, or what you guys call the mirror principle, is a great filter for understanding Ukraine. Just listen to anything that comes out of Ukraine or on Ukraine's behalf by the West, particularly the British and the Americans, that says the Russians are going to do this, or this happened to the Russians, or that happened to the Russians. Just substitute the word Ukraine for them. So like they're saying, hey, Victory Day is very important to the Russians. They're going to do something. They're going to stage something. They're going to accelerate. They really wanted to win by Victory Day, et cetera, et cetera. None of which there was any evidence to believe in. And there was no big Putin speech about, yes, we are now going to war and, full declaration of war, national mobilization, going to draft bring in the reserves, draft another 10 million Russians to flood in there because we're just getting whooped every day by these tough Ukrainians who are substitute Wolverines from the movie Red Dawn, like Adam Kinzinger wearing a lame T-shirt, which Amanda Milius, the daughter of John Milius, the man who made that movie, took shots at him. So like you can believe what you want to be for, but these people aren't the Wolverines. Let's come on. She actually worked in the Trump White House at the State Department, so so knows that whole background. But in that kind of dynamic framework, the military can't hold. We've always known they can't hold. We can only lie so much and so often. These OSINT people look like the people from the pandemic, the public health experts that came out during the pandemic that showed the whole world they're fake. And you see it in people who are just what I call data people, just like they were just data people in the pandemic who ended up becoming radicalized and red-pilled politically because they're like, you guys are just lying about this data. These masks aren't working. This vaccine doesn't have quite the safety and effectiveness you're claiming it does. Lockdowns don't appear to be effective. The disease isn't quite impactful in the communities you're claiming it is. And they got politically active, your Justin Harts of the world, because they witnessed the corruption of data by the fake public health world. Same thing is happening in the military context. All these OSINT people who just repeat nonsense day after day after day. I read one the other day that's on Substack. That's a former U.S. Army intelligence guy. And he's still saying stuff like, oh, the Russians' attempts to bomb and hit the railway stations aren't working. So, did he miss what Ukrainians' own reports on this? I mean, this is this is the degree of lunacy he's feeding his audience. It's like the people that are saying mask or that are like triple mask still while they're riding a bike or they're out canoeing. It's those kind of people. They still have that mindset. They've just applied it to the Ukrainian conflict. But there's no way internal Pentagon people are that dumb or that crazy. They knew from day one this is an unsustainable conflict unless we get direct intervention. And whatever delusional NATO aspects there were saying, look, we got a 250,000 army. We've trained them for 8 years. We've built in mass fortifications along the eastern section in the Donbass. Armchair Warlord did a great breakdown on what those fortifications look like. So did Defense Politics Asia, the YouTube channel. And this is just an Indonesian guy who just likes military stuff. He's not trying to get involved politically at all. But what he's seeing day to day is the same things the Military and General Affairs YouTube network saw, which is, wow, the Western sources are complete crap day after day. They said the ship sank, it didn't. They say this attack happened, it didn't. They say they took back Snake Island, it didn't. Like old Defense Politics Asia did was he just broke down the Snake Island. He's like, why would they bring a helicopter? Where did they bring the helicopter from? There's not even enough gas to get from Sevastopol to Snake Island and back. Why would they land on a place that's not the helipad? It's like all of this screams Ukraine, 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 not Russia's helicopter going down. But leave it to the Ukrainians to videotape their own helicopter crashing, pretend it's a Russian helicopter crashing, and getting a bunch of people on YouTube cheering the war porn. Cheering, oh, look at those Ruskies. And they're cheering Ukraine. It's like that Ukrainian guy who videotaped himself engaging in cannibalism, saying, look, I'm eating the dead Russian corpse. And it turned out he was eating a Ukrainian soldier's corpse. I mean, it's just, So sooner or later, the propaganda and the lies can only last so long. It's hard to sustain. They're losing interest in the West. They're definitely losing interest in the United States. Like you look at Google search trends or social media discussion topics or any metric, any objective analytical metric, the level of interest in Ukraine has sunk way down in America. It's not as powerful as the pandemic. It's not as powerful as some of these other things. It's why they quickly shifted to the new thing, and the new thing is the SCOTUS opinion on abortion being leaked. And they're like, screw Ukraine. It's kind of boring. It's totally, we live in a age of people who are used to have 20-second attention spans. In an age of 20-second attention spans, unless you get Russia to do a massive attack on the West, or you get a false flag staged event of it, their ability to get troops on the ground and public support for it is dwindling by the day. And sooner or later, it's just Ukraine's going to, Novo Rusuya, or however you pronounce it, New Russia is going to exist. And it's going to be from Odessa to Kharkiv. And there's not much anybody can do about it by the end of it.
Again, Robert, I find myself in complete agreement with you. And can I just say, just going back to the very things that you started with about Russian self-sufficiency, I was very interested to see that James Galbraith, now you probably know about him, he's the son of J.K. Galbraith, the economist, and he's an economist himself. And James Galbraith is one of the sort of princes of liberal democratic party. So he was very close to Obama, and he was, by the way, an advisor to Prime Minister Tsipras in Greece, amongst other things. But anyway, so he's not someone who you would expect to deviate from the party line, if you like. But he had this to say about Russia. He said, in a test of wills and power, Russia starts from a strong position. She is nearly self-sufficient in every essential, including energy, food, heavy machinery, and weapons. The loss of familiar Western consumer goods and services can be made up through local initiatives, not lacking in today's Russia compared to Soviet times or from China. Russia's financial assets greatly exceed her debts, even after the loss of foreign-held reserves. And then it goes on into more specifics. And can I just say, I had a chat the other day with a business person who's not actually Russian, but whose business is in fact located in Russia. And this person told me two things. Firstly, that some of the Western companies that have claimed to have pulled out, these consumer companies, they're actually still there. What they've just done is that in order to conform with the EU pressure, they've simply changed the name of the business. So it's still the same people. They're still getting the same advice and directions from the head office. They're still putting all their money in ruble accounts, which one day they hope to be able to take back. But they're still there and clinging on to the market, the market they have in Russia. Now, of course, some of the subcomponents they have to import from the West. You can't do this. They can't all do this. But even a lot of Western brands in Russia apparently increasingly use Russian materials for their products so that they can sustain this not just for a long time, but they can evolve it considerably. And this person also told me that she also, and she's the sort of, she's in the service sector, but she's the sort of person who, again, is the kind of person who these sanctions might have been expected to deter. She's sticking there, and she's already finding other partners, other ways of adapting her business to the new sanctions. And she expects to be sorted through within a couple of months at most. So this is what people do. Russia has self-sufficiency, but it also has the inherent flexibilities that come from being a proper market economy. In some ways, it's more of a market economy today than some of the market economies in the West. So that's one thing I did want to say. So you see, even James Galbraith, even people in Russia itself, are coming back and they're telling me these things. And I think, I'm quite convinced that this is all entirely true. Now, I have to say, I'm glad you brought out this topic of a certain draft opinion, because this is the other thing that really concerns me, because we see so many things going on in the United States where it seems to me that law, due process, all those kind of things that we valued, all those things that made the West, if you like, are simply being ignored now. And if we come back to the Russian thing, we have this extraordinary idea that's being floated around of seizing the assets of all these private persons, their yachts, their bank accounts, and giving the money to Ukraine. Now, as I understand it, that is actually illegal in the United States. You can't do that. That's prohibited by the Constitution, and it's prohibited by international law. But it's going to happen. I mean, I can't imagine this bunch who are in power now are going to let a simple thing like the law stand in their way of doing these kind of things. Any thoughts about this, Robert?
I mean, I think it's definitely illegal.
Yeah.
It's in order to take
Yeah.
anyone's property,
Yeah.
they have to meet certain standards. Now, if it's a foreign government or foreign person's property, then there are less legal remedies available, practically speaking, for them, but not no remedy. And so there's been plenty, and like including I'm gonna mispronounce his name, but Oleg Deripaska, however you pronounce it, he brought suit in the United States when they seized various aspects of his property. Typically, what happened is they used to just freeze the property, and they got around the issue of seizure by never actually seizing it. They just froze the accounts, and the account stayed frozen in perpetuity. Maybe this is what the Brits are thinking about the sale of Chelsea proceeds. That they're saying they'll release them to charity of some given choice. The Hunter Biden art project would be probably on the top of the list. But people ask, why did Joe Biden go to Ukraine? Somebody had to pick up that check because Hunter's busy in rehab in Malibu. So, that's the mindset of what's kind of taking place. But I think usually they just freeze it, and they do so for legal reasons. One, political reason, to have it leveraged to say you can easily release it back. And so thus it becomes part of negotiations will release the funds. But the other reason was as long as they didn't seize it and give it to someone else or expend it on something else, then it had a different kind of legal status. It wasn't quite the same as stolen property, which is what this is. This is state-sanctioned piracy. We're back to the privateering stage. Not only that, they're actually talking about employing actual privateers. I mean, in the United States, they're talking about giving people a percentage if they locate Russian assets that they get to steal. It's like when we're back to the 1800s, in literal privateer status. For those that don't know, pirates were legal as long as they were given a license to go steal from the other country's ships. I mean, that's where the word false flag comes from. Pirates would put up a flag pretending to be the Brits or the Spanish or the French. And in fact, they were just the pirates, and they didn't put the Jolly Pirate up until right at the end. When they were seizing the ship. So to me, all of this, my understanding is the Russian government is already looking at bringing suit everywhere they can to unfreeze these assets and to return these assets. So, and I think an EU official even acknowledged they were annoyed by it, but they acknowledged, well, there are all these laws about property in some of these countries, and I guess we can't steal it right away. It tells you the mindset of these people. But so I think, and there'll be extensive litigation. The big question is, will the executive branch actually obey the law, and will they just take it and spend it? In the same way, the fact they're asking for $40 billion tells you that they're not yet committed to the position of actually spending that money, because that's one of the arguments against the $40 billion. Like, well, you said that you can just spend this money, spend what you stole, don't take more. But there is the intention publicly of stealing it for the purposes of giving it back to Ukraine, which Ukraine's just one big laundromat. That money will come right back out. I mean, the idea will go to the ordinary Ukrainian. I mean, how much has all the aid over the last 25 years gone to the ordinary Ukrainian? How do they end up the poorest country in Europe? If in fact this money was meant for the ordinary person in Ukraine. And this, again, was a resource-rich country. It's not like, this is the breadbasket of Europe going back before World War I and the rest. One of the reasons why the Germans and the Russians and the Poles all fought over it in part.
And the top donator to the Hillary Clinton Foundation, to the Clinton Foundation as well.
If you look it up, Ukrainians show up at a lot of places. They show up as the top 10 corruption, top 10 human trafficking in different reports in different years, things like that. But also probably the biolabs were part of that. They're just kind of a cheap colony you could experiment on. You could treat them like an individual rendition. Was this country subject to the whims of the West and the sort of colonial mindset of experimentation and whatnot? But yeah, I mean, the top donors to individual donors to the Clinton Foundation came from Ukraine. Ukraine shows up. It's not a coincidence that the number one source of funds for the Biden family for a decade was Ukraine. And, the Hunter, not just Hunter Biden, but Joe and also his brother and his sister, they're all part of the grift. And then they expanded the grift intelligently to add, John Kerry's a stepson, to add various other family members that were tied in with the Clinton Foundation and the rest. So there isn't a big name Democrat that didn't get a little, Pelosi's people, or son was connected to it, that didn't get a little bit of the grift that is Ukraine. And that will continue to be a grift with this other funding coming in. But I think in terms of what's happening legally, there are limitations. I think there'll be a lot of fights over the sanctions cases. I think their ability to get away with it, at least in the United States, will probably be restricted. The only question is what the courts will do about it. Will they have the political courage to do what they did not have the political courage to do during much of the lockdowns, during a lot of others, during the election fornication that took place, which was extraordinary. Say, Joe Biden's the way Joe Biden screws America, he clearly does. The one drug he does not need is Viagra, because he does it all day and all night long. But that mindset and mentality of what's happening with the courts is reflective of why the Supreme Court leak mattered. Right? In the past, if there had been a leaked draft opinion, nobody would believe that would impact the vote of the justices. Because for those that don't know, I mean, what happens is the court takes petitions for cert, the U.S. Supreme Court. They decide whether to grant what's called cert, which is to look at review. You need 4 of the 9 for that. Then they have briefing done by the parties and what's called amici briefs, third parties. The Roe v. Wade case had amici from everywhere. Then they do oral argument. Oral argument usually tells you where the mindset of the justices are. When that happened, I predicted that Roe v. Wade would be overturned and it would be sent back to the states, just based on the briefing and the statements by the justices at the time. It was clear there were 5 votes, probably 6, to affirm the Mississippi law, and 5 votes at least to overturn Roe v. Wade fully, based on comments and statements that were made. Now, that doesn't make abortion illegal in America. It just leaves it up to states what the future of the legality of abortion is. California is trying to figure out ways to help, pregnant mothers do meth and not have consequences when their babies die by legalizing infanticide. So there's going to be plenty of states in America where abortion is completely legal, and legal at a rate that it's not in Europe. I mean, people don't understand that in most of Europe and most of the world, abortion in the second term and the third term, late term abortions, partial, are not legal. America has an extreme pro-abortion view on the world. I mean, kind of like where Russia and China was during the Soviet days and during the communist days at the peak. So, but why does a law clerk leak that opinion? Because they've seen the same Supreme Court stick their head in the sand during the pandemic and refuse to enforce constitutional liberties for a year. They've seen the same Supreme Court hesitate to rule on religious rights on vaccines and not even protect members of the military and medical community on an emergency basis by delaying a meaningful decision. They've seen the same court, even including the 3 justices appointed by Donald Trump, run and hide and cower like cowards when the election issues were right before them, to at least rule on, whichever way they ruled, to at least rule on, make a determination as to what happened in those elections and the integrity of them and the confidence we can have in them. So, of course, liberal law clerks looks up there and says, you can intimidate these justices. They will be politically terrified to question or challenge Just like an ordinary judge will be politically terrified to enforce the law as to sanctions against a Russian person or a Russian institution. To such a degree, the Boston Marathon felt confident, racially and ethnically discriminating and saying, if you are Russian or Belarusian, you cannot run in the Boston Marathon. A Boston Marathon that would have never had that terror event had they listened to Russians about the dangers of two certain individuals. But that's another story for another day, as I like to say. But you look at that, the confidence that clerk has to say, if I leak this, the media will celebrate the leak. A bunch of people will start stalking Supreme Court justices outside their home and threatening them outside their home. The mayor of Chicago issued this was her language, a call to arms. Can you imagine if Donald Trump on January 6th had issued an explicit call to arms? They would still have him in the same detention centers they have the January 6th protesters in. And so, which by the way, the Russians cited as an example that America doesn't really care about the rule of law. Another political problem with how that case has been handled, aside from the constitutional problems. So it shows where we're at. It's a bad state of affairs that the Supreme Court of the United States is seen by its own law clerks as so politically vulnerable to public opinion and to terror tactics, to street theater. I mean, you guys would understand better than the average American that you go, like from your historical series, the idea of street theater is a European 1920s, 1930s kind of invention. In that, in Germany, the fascists and the communists would compete, the Nazis would compete to see who could own the street, believing that if you own the street, you own the political space. It didn't quite translate that way, but in their minds it did. I mean, they're all excited about, whether it was the black shirts and the brown shirts in certain places, or the Nazis or the commies in other places. It's that mindset that, Antifa has here in the United States. I mean, Antifa, again, was, a German invention, really all the way back to the days of when they were communists disguised as anti-fascists. But, the modern contemporary version of Antifa started in the 1970s in Germany. And it's the belief that if you own the streets, you can intimidate public officials to do your bidding. That's foreign to the history of the Supreme Court of the United States in America. And yet you have a law clerk within the Supreme Court who believes that's the case. And now, to be frank, if they don't issue the Alito opinion, they're going to look very, very bad, because then it will happen again and again and again. I mean, right now, Justice Alito, the U.S. Marshals who provide the security to the Supreme Court had to put him in hiding. That's how bad it is. So it's a terrifying time to be alive, in the sense of not only the risk of nuclear war, but with people, Wall Street Journal had a piece. Hey, maybe we could win a nuclear war. I mean, this George P. Scott, Dr. Strangelove thing was not supposed to be a preview. Just like Orwell's 1984 was not supposed to be a predictive script. But they sound like the Great Reset. Whenever you hear the Great Reset, it sounds like the pigs telling everybody, no, we have to have the milk and apples because it's good for you. And you have to eat the slop because that's what's necessary. But I think you're right that what happened with the Supreme Court is very scary, very frightening. And it, looked like kind of the British High Court, the way they wussed out on the Julian Assange case. If it looks like they could be so easily politically, publicly pressured by Antifa types to change their opinion of a Supreme Court about an issue of such consequences as abortion, boy, we're in bad state in the United States.
Absolutely, because of course the Supreme Court is an absolutely pivotal part of the American constitutional structure. It's the keystone to the whole arch, because it's the body that, to my mind, administers. It tells you, it interprets the Constitution in an authoritative way. Now, if you undermine the Supreme Court, then you undermine the whole constitutional and legal system, and you strike at its foundations. Now, I have to say, I worked, as you know, in the Royal Courts of Justice in Britain. We don't have anything remotely equivalent to the Supreme Court in the US Supreme Court in Britain. We have something that's called the Supreme Court, which was created by Tony Blair, and it is a powerful court, but it is in no way analogous to the Supreme Court of the United States, because we do not have what you are very fortunate to have in the United States, which is a real constitution written out by some really extraordinary people, and one which can be used to protect and defend rights and to, in some ways, mediate also on political struggles. So we don't have anything like that. But I have to say, if there'd been a comparable leak of a draft judgment anywhere in Britain within the higher court system, by which I mean the High Court, the Court of Appeal, or indeed the Supreme Court or the House of Lords as it once was, well, I mean, the consequences for anybody who did that would have been enormous. We would have had police in, we would have had investigations, there would have been the lawyers on both sides would have been deeply shocked and deeply worried. And of course, in politically charged cases, the political system, the politicians would have been horrified as well. And what do we see in the United States? We see something completely different. We see a court, the Supreme Court, which I've always assumed, because of its importance and because of its historic, excellence in many ways, that Americans have an enormous deference to. Do people rush to its defense? Hardly. The White House has issued some, mealy-mouthed comments. There's no particular concern about the draft being published, and the fact that people are turning up outside the houses of Supreme Court justices is, well, it's something that some people shrug their shoulders about. And can you just repeat here on this program what you said to me before we started this program, Robert? Because I did ask whether, in fact, protesting like that outside the house of a judge would be a criminal offense. And I think, you answered that question very fully, but perhaps you could answer it again with our viewers listening.
Yeah, so there's two different aspects. One is the federal law. So you have a First Amendment right of broad protest, but that is limited by federal law. A federal law can't limit the First Amendment, but the courts can interpret it as consistent to the First Amendment, and they have. And the particular law says that when it comes to the judicial branch, you cannot stalk them individually. You cannot protest them individually at their private, anywhere outside the courtroom, period. So, and that's not limited to the lawyer or the parties. Nobody should be communicating ever to a judge outside of the official proceedings, because the worry is that will influence the judge illicitly in the sense that the judge's decision is supposed to be solely and wholly made based on what happened inside the courtroom, the legal briefings, the legal pleadings, the oral arguments, the evidence adduced, not based on anybody's third-party claim about evidence, about law, about policy, about personal threats, you name it. So that's always been legally suspect, but it turns illegal when there's a directed effort at an individual, especially at the individual's residence in particular. That's especially criminalized under federal law. It's a federal misdemeanor. It is also a state crime, and in some cases a state felony in the state of Virginia, and in most states in the United States, many of these justices live in Virginia, the rest live in the District of Columbia for the most part, is to actually do any picketing at a judge's house, period, ever. And again, the reason for, some people are confused by this. They're like, well, you can picket at a congressman's house. You can picket at a mayor's house. Yes, because that's not considered an attempt to obstruct justice, to corrupt justice on an existing court case. That's the difference here. You cannot do it for the purpose of, and they're explicitly and expressly admitting they're directly targeting a justice at his home for the purpose of changing his opinion on a pending case. That's obstruction of justice, pure and simple. So not only are there specific laws that govern this, it fits, frankly, within the general obstruction of justice charge. I have no doubt. I mean, consider this. The people who walked into the Capitol without approval on January 6th, are being prosecuted for obstruction of justice, for obstruction of a congressional proceeding, even though they were never able to obstruct it at all. So if that's obstruction of a congressional proceeding, how is directly targeting a justice at his home to make him feel uncomfortable about a pending case not obstruction of a judicial proceeding? It clearly is. All of these people could be arrested tomorrow, but none of them will be, because the political reality is that in D.C. especially, DC is so it's happening in the January 6 cases. Nobody can get an impartial jury in January. Roger Stone, we saw that with Roger Stone's case. It is not possible. The Antifa cases. There are a bunch of Antifa cases that effectively got no billed by grand juries or no conviction by juries, despite overwhelming evidence, because they're basically jury nullification of Antifa charges. So the DC jury pool is actually worse, in my opinion, than a 1950s Birmingham jury pool would have been towards Martin Luther King or civil rights movement. That's how bad the District of Columbia has become, because they welcome the politicization. They believe in, like your Birmingham jury that's corrupt. They convince themselves they're not really corrupt. The DC jury pool knows they're corrupt, and they're proud of it because they're doing God's business. They're doing the righteous work. And that's what I've tried to explain to people is that the new left thinks like a 1930s Marxist. They do not think like a 1960s Berkeley free speech movement liberal. This is not Abby Hoffman. This is more like Trotsky. And so their mindset is the ends always justify the means. Period. And so they're totalitarian in their mindset. That's why they are obsessed with everything, obsessed with employment, with culture, with games, with movies, with TV shows. They have to have complete control, carte blanche all the time, everywhere. But they're also authoritarian in mindset. The ends completely justify the means. And you're seeing public statements to this effect. I mean, you're seeing blue checkmark people talk about maybe someone should think about assassinating one or two of the justices. I mean, say that out loud and say, well, I'm just thinking of it as a hypothetical and a ethic. No, they know you're not. You're trying to put the idea out there. That's where their mindset is. The ends justify. It's very much like, Lenin or Stalin or Trotsky sitting there saying, well, we got to purge a few 100,000 people. It's necessary for the greater good. I mean, that's how the new left thinks in America, at least. I don't know about the rest of the West, but definitely in America. And so it's massive criminal behavior, just like the BLM riots throughout the summer. Like I'm thinking about writing a book about the 2020 election and calling it America's Color Revolution, to put it in the broader because the BLM was part of that. The pandemic lockdowns were part of that. All of it helped set up a situation where the election fornication could take place. But that's what's happening. It's shocking, though. People like Jonathan Turley, your old school classic liberals, are shocked at this. They're like, how in the world are all these lawyers, all these legal professionals, all these public officials, including as you note, the White House, basically green lighting, stalking and a massive criminal behavior by their constituency solely to try to stop one opinion from getting issued, which, if they were to succeed, as you note, would discredit the most important legal institution, frankly, arguably in the world. Because what happens when the world witnesses this? If the United States Supreme Court can be this easily politically contaminated just by public stalking and harassment, can we have confidence in any judicial branch in any part of the world?
This is completely true. Can I just say what you described as criminal offences in the United States with respect to pressure on justices? Just to also say there are criminal offences in Britain. The offences are contempt of court, which is, of course, an offence. It can be both criminal and civil, and sometimes not an offence at all. But it's something which is within the control of the court. But there's also a criminal offence, a specific criminal offence, which is seeking to pervert the course of justice, which is, I think, quite plausibly what this is actually. I should say I don't have any kind of background as a criminal lawyer, but I've come across these things in my time. And I have to say, it seems to me that they fall squarely within this same practice. And again, I'm astonished that it's happened, that it's been able to happen in the United States. I'm amazed that it has not provoked the kind of comment that you might have expected from the people that you mentioned, lawyers, newspapers, whatever. I was reading an absolutely horrible article this morning in The Guardian by somebody who I believe is American, and who was justifying the protests against the justices, which I was amazed that it could even appear in The Guardian. And the point I want to always say, protections of due process, the proper administration of justice, the people who need those things most are those in society who are most vulnerable. I mean, that is why they are the people who need the protection of the law more than anyone else. All of us, to some extent and at some time and in some way, need the protection of the law, from, Russian oligarchs to everybody. But the people who need it most are those who are most vulnerable, because if the law isn't there, they are the most threatened. And they were the people that the Democratic Party, once upon a time, aspired to represent. And it's staggering to me that the Democratic Party has so completely forgotten that, as, by the way, has the Labour Party in Britain. And if I could just quickly add something with respect to we've had local elections in Britain fairly recently. And it was, again, very striking that the places where the Labour Party managed to make some inroads against the Conservatives was not in the sort of working class areas which it once represented, which used to identify strongly with the Labour Party and where the Labour Party was founded. But in places like Westminster, the city of Westminster, the affluent, rich, socially liberal places in London, not amongst the working class places, as I said, which the Labour Party was once set up to create, to represent and defend. And it seems to me the Democrats have gone in exactly the same way in the United States, only much further.
Yeah, the US and the UK tend to parallel each other.
Yeah.
I follow them because they tend to be predictive of trends. So, Margaret Thatcher in 1979, well, you can even go further back. I mean, to a certain degree, was it Harold Ramsey was kind of like very kind of Carter-esque in the 70s. But Margaret Thatcher's rise in 1979 presaged Ronald Reagan in 1980. John Major presaged Poppy Bush, the very similar kind of 1988, 1990 kind of political people. Their political collapse. Bill Clinton presaged Tony Blair, who was actually advised by Stanley Greenberg, Clinton's pollster. And the mistakes of Tony Blair presaged the mistakes of George W. Bush, and both of them getting a neck deep in the Iraqi war and embracing a globalist clique as their basis and predicate of power, which led to the populist revolutions at different times that went in different directions, but that were foreshadowing things, especially Brexit and Trump. The Brexit vote heavily presaged Trump, just as the Tory success, to some degree, presaged American Republican congressional success. Now, in terms of the thing right now is that you have someone like the Tory leadership is like a Mitt Romney leadership in the States. And because that's so unpopular, you have what the Tories should be consolidating their gains. What's happening to the Tories and not doing as well as they could have in these elections should be a warning sign to Republicans in the States. Stay away from pandemic politics, embracing pandemic politics of lockdowns and mandates and the rest. Continue to oppose those, and do not get neck deep in another dumb war, another dumb foreign war, because if you do, you're going to limit your growth. Because I think if they had not jumped on the war train and had not been so neck deep in the pandemic politics, the Tories would have made major gains this past time. Because the Labor Party, as you notice, like the Democratic Party here, they're not a viable alternative for working class voters.
No.
But, nor to some extent were the Tories because of they're opening the door to a rise of a Nigel Farage independent party finally in the UK. And we'll see if that translates. But in the States, the populist alternative is more robust, but the same working class trend is happening. It's just accelerating.
Yeah.
Like Ohio, what happened in Youngstown and that area, people can go back and listen to Bruce Springsteen's song about Youngstown. That was the heart, but it's taken a heavy hit over the past several decades. And let me give an example. Northeast Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, key states in elections, gubernatorial and senatorial and House races upcoming in this midterms. It's steel country. It's the heart of the steel industry in the United States. Well, what did the dimwit Biden do the other day? he removed steel tariffs on Ukraine. It's like, well, hold on a second. So you're going to figure out a totally new way to screw workers in America. I mean, it's like, now it's probably going to be a while before Ukraine has a lot of exports going out anyway, so it's probably not going to matter too much. But of course, what can happen is that when you say steel from this place can come in, steel from someplace else comes in disguised as steel from there. I mean, China did this when they were getting around Trump's tariffs all the time. They just relabel, we'll send it to the Philippines and boom, we'll send it here and boom. So, I mean, it's the problem with sanctions in the modern global environment, which Russian oil is the perfect example of.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you figure out it's Russian, right? Is the oil like, does it like sing a song or does it do something, magic? It's not there. So ultimately, I think that this politically will backfire in terms of what's happening in the Supreme Court. I think there'll be 5 justices that will stick with the Alito opinion precisely because of this. I think they would have likely gone there anyway, but Kavanaugh is a real, back and forth kind of guy. He was only put on the bench because Kennedy told Trump he would only retire if he would anoint Kavanaugh. So that's how Kavanaugh got picked. Barrett was just a bad choice by Trump. Some of us told him at the time. He didn't listen, unfortunately. But he's getting a little bit better. But there you have the defense secretary. Is kind of a temporary defense secretary, but still a defense secretary. Esper goes on 60 Minutes and just bashes Trump and talks about how he was basically planning quasi-coup-like behavior towards Trump while he was in Trump's administration. And Trump has to put out a thing saying, rhinos told me to hire him. And it's like, well, maybe don't listen to those opinions anymore. Like Sean Hannity was encouraging him to endorse his old friend, Dr. Oz. Oz voted in Turkey in 2018. So it's kind of, an unusual U.S. senator to have a guy who voted in Turkey to be running for the United States Senate. And it'll be interesting to watch in Pennsylvania. There's a candidate, Kathy Barnett, that comes up. She's kind of new to the populist game, platform, but she's at least the only one voicing populist concerns opposed to globalism. I mean, called out the World Economic Forum, called out the globalist effort, is starting to make anti-war statements to that effect. And she's surging. And she has almost no money. She's gone from single digits to double digits and within the margin of error of first place just by embracing this populist platform. So the populist platform is an anti-war platform, still is. And I get like the anti-war left that still keeps interpreting this as an American empire. They're misunderstanding. I mean, I get it if you want to I get like Putin sort of jabbing Europe, saying you're the junior partners to America because French, do you feel good with them saying, garçon, whatever, the Brits, do you feel good being the little puppy following the dog? I get that. It works to appeal to a European audience. But as a mantra as a filter, as a predictive filter, an explanatory filter, it doesn't really work. One, empires actually deliver goods for the benefit of the people most of the time. At least popular empires do. The Mongol, there was both folks at home in Mongolia weren't unhappy with the Mongolian Empire. The people at home in the Vikings or the French or the British or the Russians or the Austro-Germans or the Ottomans, any of them, they all profited from the empire. The American people do not benefit from these imperial adventures. In fact, all they're going to do is lose treasure and lose blood. It's part of Trump's point. Like, Trump's argument wasn't like just an instinctive anti-war argument. It was, what good is this? We're going to lose money and lose men. Why? What for? I don't get it. This is very much a globalist empire vision, a globalist clique that has that uses its most powerful institutions, which is really the European Union. Second, the Biden administration. But there is not deep support within the American public for any of this. And I think ultimately there will be political blowback on it. And I think that ultimately it won't prevail in the way they want. But we have to dodge the next 6 months and I would say particularly the next 3 months. Yeah, because that's the peak time for a false flag event or a state. I don't think Putin, I'd be curious what you guys think. I don't think Putin will make the mistake of a direct attack on the West that could be used as a pretext for direct military intervention with troops on the ground and planes in the skies to do so. But what do you guys think?
I think you're absolutely right. And can I say, if you had any doubts about that, if you thought that he could be goaded into doing something of this, then the extremely careful and very measured, very calm speech he gave at the Victory Day celebrations should tell you that he is absolutely clear about the risks of doing something like that, and he's not going to do it. He spoke very, very calmly, And of course, as we did a program about this, and Alex pointed out that he actually spoke with regret about the absence of American veterans at the event, and that he would have liked American veterans to be actually there. And by the way, you're absolutely right. He did refer to the Empress, the 18th century Empress, only her name was Catherine. And he quoted, referenced three of her generals. This was in the speech that he made at the Victory Day celebrations. He referenced Potyomkin, Suvorov, and Rumyantsev, who were all people who fought in Donbass, in Ukraine, in Crimea, and who basically captured these territories from the Ottomans and made them part of Russia and arranged for the people of Russia to settle there. So he knows the risks. He knows actually the United States very well. And this is the thing people don't realize about Putin. He's been around now for a very long time. I mean, he became acting prime minister of Russia in 1999. He's an intelligent man. He's got an enormous intelligence gathering operation briefing him. And he follows American politics very closely. And he's very well aware of all of the things that, we're saying about how people in the West, in the United States, the neocons, all of those people would love him to trip, to escalate recklessly, to start some sort of reckless thing, with nuclear weapons or chemical weapons or gas attacks or missile strikes on Poland or advances on Lithuania or something of that kind. And he won't do it. I mean, remember what they were saying in the run-up to his speech, that he'd order general mobilization, he'd declare war on Ukraine, he'd do some of these dramatic things, and he did none of them. He was very calm and very measured. And I think a lot of people in Britain, where, I mean, we're even, we take all the worst of the belligerence of these people in the Biden administration, and we take it that bit step further. They were all very, very disappointed, and they've been goading the Russians to go that bit further ever since. By the way, on the question of the American empire, just to add one very, very quick point, because this is a big subject. Again, it never ceases to astonish me that Americans don't understand how manipulative the relationship between the US and Europe is. The extent to which the European political class, I don't mean here the general European population, have been using American power to work out their own objectives. And as I repeatedly say, if you're talking about globalization, don't look for its origins in Washington. Look for its origins in Europe. And, old money Europe, especially. I used to know these people. I used to mix with them. I know the kind of opinions they have. The kind of people who went on skiing holidays in Switzerland in the 60s and 70s, and still do, of course, went to a particular resort, got together, set up their little group there, exchanged their ideas, and basically that's where globalization was born.
That's why Trump is like the blue collar bull in a china shop. It's like some of these things were not like well thought out. It's not like he spent a long time reading Realpolitik or listening to John Mearsheimer or any of that. He was just like, why should we do what you people want? I mean, it's like you sit around in the Germans like, you're complaining. You're the one buying all the Russian oil. Do your own problem. And they're sitting there snickering at him. And that's where he was. I do think John Bolton is right when Bolton said that if Trump had won in 2020, and this was the other reason why Ukraine had to happen now, that Trump was serious about pulling out of NATO. That's what Bolton says Trump kept talking about all the time, and then he would have done it had he got in. He ran on it in 2016, and then he backed off of it when he got institutional criticism. But the reality is this, well, people can watch the interaction and the body language between Trump and Zelensky in the White House, where Trump's like, I hope you work that out with Putin, buddy. I mean, you could tell that it was not a very favorable or sympathetic one. I mean, to give it a sense of deep state power, Kolomoisky, I may be mispronouncing his name, but the Ukrainian oligarch who also has Israeli citizenship, who helped fund the TV station that funds Zelensky's whole career, helped fund all the neo-Nazi militias, which people find peculiar because he's Jewish. But what they don't understand is, especially in the Russian mindset, Nazi is anti-Russian much more than it's anti-Jewish. Probably because 27 million people in the Soviet Union died during that war, or whatever the number is. Some say 24, 27, whatever. It's still more than the 6 million even people that died in the Holocaust. I mean, so that's why Russians have that mindset that, 1 out of 10 Russians died in a 4-year time period, and 1 out of 2 or 1 out of 3 actually served in the war in one capacity or another, or had the war come to their front door, quite literally. That's why Victory Day I try to explain to people in the States, it was like maybe if you combine July 4th with the Civil War, with World War II, you have a bit of the mindset of what Victory Day means to the Russian people. And it's like I said today, not to insult them, which was, I saw a lot of that out of the West. It was like, and they put in Times Square, they put up a big sign that said, "This isn't Russian Victory Day, it's Russian Shame Day." It's like that's just a stupid statement. That's just this. That would be like somebody opposing us doing that on our July 4th. If you want to enrage us, okay. There was a dumb message to spread. But that's how dumb these elites are. These cliques of power who want to be invited to the next Bilderberg, want to be invited to the next Bohemian Grove, want to be invited to the right charity ball for whatever the cause of the day is. All of that sort of mindset mentality is sort of widely and wildly afoot. And I agree that that's the clique that sort of dictates and determines and shapes power on the foreign policy arena, but it's not something the ordinary American individual has any interest in. It's just there's a gap between representational power and political will because the sort of deep state apparatus has co-opted so much of this representative class with their control over donors, their control over the media. Also, it's their payoff, right? Like you look at Zelensky, at this point, it's obvious he could care less about Ukraine. Nobody sensible that cared about his own people would be not even at the negotiations table. Yeah. And instead issuing childish, it's like the character from Monty Python, right? With his arms cut off and his legs cut off. And he's like, it's only a scratch. Come on. That's what Ukraine sounds like. That's what Zelensky said. He's like, we're going to take back Crimea. Russia's going to surrender everything. That's the only unconditional Russian surrender. That's the only option. It's like, This is idiocy. You sound like an idiot to the whole globe. There's a reason why the entire rest of the world has not signed on to this, not signed on to sanctions, wouldn't even sign on to an affirmative vote to take Russia off of a meaningless human rights committee of the United Nations in terms of Mexico and Brazil and Kenya and Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Indonesia and India. It's because of this. And so, and there's talk here. The other irony is twofold to transition to a couple other topics. One is you saw these people with Ukrainian flags in their little bios on social media saying that, hey, Solomon Islands, that's not acceptable. China can't be there. And it's like, oh, these are the same people that are saying Russia can't protect itself against any risk in Ukraine. But somehow the United States is supposed to get involved in the Solomon Islands next to China. The escalation with Taiwan, as you guys mentioned, why we took that off the State Department. They know how sensitive this issue is to China. So to make the change on something we've had about, that Taiwan is part of China, and we've had that there as part of our agreement going all the way back when we decided to recognize it. And compliments to the commenters at the Duran.locals.com. One point they made was that their belief was that China would be as sensitive as Russia is to any invasion in Taiwan, that they see it as other Chinese people. It was a reminder that in the States, we have a frozen view of Taiwan, that essentially Taiwan was just where the nationalists left China and they took over, and we recognize them as kind of a joke. It's not as bad as that fake president we recognize from Venezuela. But, pretending that Taiwan was governing all of China for like a decade plus and even had the UN seat, in retrospect, really looks kind of embarrassing. But putting that aside, in our mindset, it's the last anti-communist. It's that's who's there. They're deeply anti-China, and that they need the U.S. to protect them from the big bully of China. What's missing from that narrative is that 6 of the 8 million people who lived in Taiwan at the time didn't come over from the nationalists. They were Chinese living on the island. That Taiwan had to impose a dictatorship for decades because they didn't have popular support on the island. And that as recently as 2014, there was at least some movement towards a treaty agreement that would have made a one China, two systems agreement, but go in force in Taiwan. Now, then there was I think it was called the Sunflower Revolt, all that, and at least in the elections of late, the independent side, the more independent side has won by 15 to 20 points in the presidential elections. And I think some people who say that, the Taiwanese army would just drop their arms the moment China arrives are not accurate. But if they're accurate, that China would be as careful with limiting civilian casualties and collateral damage as Russia has tried to be in Ukraine, then frankly, there's almost no way for China to win that war. You're talking about an island country with mountains that's got half the population of Ukraine or a little more, but in a much more compact, urban, dense location. And if you're not going to damage civilian locations, and you're not going to do civilian collateral damage, and you're not going to do mass bombing raids, and you're going to be scared of injuring your fellow Chinese as you see it from the Chinese perspective, I don't see China going into Taiwan. I think the only chance that happens is if the U.S. puts dangerous weapons right on Taiwan or is about to. And unfortunately, we're talking about trying to do that. But I don't think Taiwan's dumb enough to take the bait on that. Even though it's a woke independence movement. It's very youth-oriented. Like their commissioner of something another is man, woman, it's one of those situations. It's that kind of thing. And so I think, but that's totally foreign to the American mindset. The American mindset still thinks of Taiwan as the anti-communist who landed there in 1945 or 46, whatever it was, or 49 maybe. But that's how the popular perception is within at least the political right in the United States. They don't understand this other context. Now, I'm sure the State Department people do and other people do, but why the Biden administration, knowing that this is a real sensitive topic, and it goes to a point you made earlier, Alexander, at the time, that the complaint that China has is that Biden says one thing and his administration does exactly the opposite. Biden explicitly told Xi in his last call, yes, we absolutely recognize Taiwan as part of China. We're not challenging that at all. And now all of a sudden the State Department is changing something on its official page that it hasn't changed in decades about that precise question. I mean, it's clear. I think the whole world knows there's a dementia candidate in the White House. It's going to be a source of jokes for Lavrov for the next several years, and that kind of thing. But I can't believe they're serious about trying to escalate with China.
Yeah,
I think once again, like Putin, China will be more self-restrained, especially if they think sooner or later Taiwan's going to come along. That we got 45% of the vote in the last couple of elections. That was for more of a not reunification, but more for the alignment with China rather than an open adversarial relationship with China because of the economic ties, because of the cultural history, even though that's an older population that's dying off that supports that. And if they're not willing to engage in a brutal warfare, it'd be kind of tough to actually militarily dominate it. I think the only way they invade it is that they would invade it for the purpose of removing dangerous weapons that the U.S. placed there. But there's people in the U.S. seriously talking about how we could win a war with China. And it's the same thing you get with Russia. Like it's all these military analysts who say, oh, those are fake weapons. They don't really have that. That's not really capable. They won't really do that. Their army will fail in 5 seconds. They're not really that good. I mean, and people who want to see this about Russia, about Ukraine, just go back to what they said about Russia early on in Syria. How it was a disaster. Putin was a disaster. It was going to be an embarrassment. You can go through all the headlines. Same stuff. I hope we're not that stupid to try to wage war with 2 nuclear powers at the same time. But this is the Biden administration, which is setting records for stupidity.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, with Syria, I remember it took about 5 months before the narrative, at least in Britain, changed. Russia is bogged down, making no progress in Syria. That was the original narrative. And then, oh my God, Russia is actually winning. But how do we explain that? Well, they're being utterly ruthless. They're bombing hospitals and killing civilians, and that's how they're winning. But there was that period at the start of the war in Syria, the start of the Russian intervention, very much like the one that we're getting today in Ukraine, where the Russians are, failing, until, of course, suddenly it becomes clear that they're not. And again, if you track events, and we've discussed this many times, all 3 of us in various contexts, you find that in fact the Russian approach in both conflicts has been very similar. It's incremental. They build up steadily. They put their pieces in the right place. They batter the opposition, and then suddenly you get after the attrition takes its toll, you see that the collapse comes, and that seems to be very much their style of war. They don't go in a cavalry charge the way some countries do, try to achieve everything quickly, and I think probably that's not their way of the way they do things, because I suspect their experience probably is that if you try and do things fast, you might achieve quick results at the beginning, but you don't achieve that total victory, which is what you aim for. Anyway, that's just a
In other words, you end
observation.
up like the U.S. in North Korea or Afghanistan
Yeah,
or Iraq 1 or Iraq
exactly,
2 or Syria,
exactly,
Libya.
ex-
That that
exactly.
whole blitzkrieg approach sounds good, looks good for the cameras,
Yeah,
doesn't last, and it's amazing. I mean, they just used the war of it. It's fascinating seeing people say, "Oh, hold on a second. It
yeah,
looks like they're focused on the east and they're going to encircle them." It's like this has been kind
yeah,
of obvious from day one if you followed Russian
absolutely.
military strategy.
Strategy.
Um, but yeah,
Yeah,
I'm shocked at our approach to, like, we're talking about doing the same thing. I mean, I get the EU is
yeah,
really drinking the intoxicated on their own power right now.
yeah,
They're like,
yeah,
oh, we took out Russia first, even though it's failing. They're pretending otherwise, and now we're going to take out China. Yeah, we're going to
yeah,
teach you China.
mhm,
We're gonna
yeah,
sanction. It's like, oh, has anybody looked at where critical supply chain ingredients come from? I
yeah.
mean, it's like, I mean, every time, I mean, I think China's zero COVID policy is insane. Uh,
Absolutely,
they're
I
inducing
agree.
one supply chain problem after the other, but all we have to do is look at that. Just when a bit of the supply, we're gonna like block them, we're gonna like
Yeah,
sanction them. I
yeah.
mean, how is that gonna work? I mean, I don't under. This is getting crazier and crazier and
Crazy. Yeah.
crazier.
Yes. Absolutely. And I think that the other thing to say about this is, of course, the EU Commission, the central institutions in Brussels have used this affair, just as they used the pandemic, by the way, as a mechanism to expand their power over the European states and economies to incredible degrees. So, they just as they can, interfered in medical policies, in uh, I have to be used. I'm still using. I'm still careful in my use of words because we're on YT. But anyway, but I mean, they were careful in controlling vaccine production and distribution and purchasing and all of those things which up to then had always been the province of the member states. Now they're interfering in energy policy. So they're telling, a country like Hungary, you can't buy Russian oil.
Well,
You're
you're
telling
seeing this.
German companies you can't buy Russian oil either.
Well,
And of course they use sanctions to do that.
one of the more insane ideas that's out there
Yeah,
is the World Health Organization is pushing a treaty that's still in the drafting stage. There's
yeah,
stories out there that whatever the World Health Organization becomes automatically binding on other countries, at least the United States, it does not. But they're serious. You look at in the name of public health, you dig into it, and they say this gives us the right to determine supply chain issues.
yeah,
And it was defining of public health. Ultimately, it's complete economic control. The World
yeah,
Health Organization would, if this treaty was actually
yeah,
adopted by the rest of the world, would actually give the World Health Organization control over their economies as long as there was a pandemic in the country. And it's just, I mean, it's terrifying proposals. And so, these ideas are still being circulated and regurgitated. Now, I think the utility is, I still see Russia's war in Ukraine as nationalism against globalism.
yeah,
I think can the globalist empire succeed?
yeah,
If they lose in Ukraine, and this is the reason why I think they're so desperate to win, and they will resort to anything, even militarily, to try to do so, is if Russia wins, then their example is lost.
yeah,
The William Appleman Williams argument that a lot of American foreign policy was all about exemplars, so much so that we would be obsessed with what's happening in, say, El Salvador or
yeah,
Cuba, these places that don't have geopolitical power or weight,
yeah,
but because of the examples they present to the rest of the world.
yeah,
In the same context, for globalists to lose to Russia, for Russia to win economically, politically, and militarily, to have a clean sweep of the board, and for it to be Putin, the guy that George Soros, even more than Trump, just leads him in rage. As well as your David Rockefellers and your Bill Gates and others. Somebody pointed out that I made a reference to Macron and the Rothschilds, but that's because he actually worked at the Rothschild Bank. I thought that was like the reference. It's a literal specific reference. This whole, the ability for George Soros, much like Zelensky in this regime, to hide behind, well, I had a family member that was Jewish, which is almost all that it needs. I've never understood, like, a lot of anti-Semitism never made any sense to me, because it doesn't explain anything about the person whatsoever. Even if you wanted to believe something nefarious about having having a particular religious belief system, it doesn't mean anything when you don't have that religious belief system. I mean, if I told you Bill Clinton is a Baptist and Hillary Clinton is a Presbyterian, does that tell you anything useful about the Clintons? Not really.
No.
I mean, other than maybe the Clintons know how to use certain language of scriptural references. That's it. But that's not because that tells you anything about their character or their policies. And the same is true for Zelensky. It's not like he's going to Orthodox Jewish services. I mean, Zelensky's there to serve the Western purposes. You look at his stuff that's coming out that was before he got elected. He didn't care about any of this stuff. He's not. Not only does he not care about Ukraine, he doesn't care about the Azov battalion. He doesn't care about either one. He just wants to get paid. And if you look at what happened, going back to Kolomoisky, he helps him get elected. Helps build his public image for 5 years. Being the fake president. He as the Panama Papers revealed, he helped fund him to hundreds of millions of dollars in offshore shell entities that probably weren't paying Ukrainian taxes, and other things. And gets him in, and not long after he gets in, I believe he believed that Zelensky would then deliver on returning and restoring his control of the Privat Bank, which he'd stolen billions from, which Poroshenko in 2016, 2017 had cut him off from because of how bad he was stealing. But then you look at what happens. Ultimately, Zelensky doesn't do that. He tries to actually do a peace deal, and if you look at what's happening at the same time, whenever Zelensky was talking nice to Trump on that first call that led to Trump's impeachment, when you look at what him trying to go to Eastern Ukraine and talk about maybe getting a peace deal done like he talked about, and he gets blowback from the Azov battalion guys right there on the ground. When Kolomoisky was expecting to get rewarded for his 5 years of investment in Zelensky's presidential efforts, all of a sudden it starts to recede. First, you start to see Western media hit pieces. If you go back and look at when there was honest coverage, the last time there was honest coverage about the Azov battalion, a lot of it's 2019, and it's not by coincidence. Congress puts in a bill to limit funding directly to the Azov battalion. Right? The idea that these are neo-Nazis is extremely well established. Not some made up Russian propaganda from RT last week, or for the Victory Day speech. But you look at what was happening. People weren't tracking what was happening to Kolomoisky, and it shows how the deep state operates. Kolomoisky clearly was not playing ball. He wanted to do his own thing, and he thought, hey, I just elected a president. It's my turn to run the show. I helped fund a lot of these neo-Nazi Azov battalion guys back in 14 and 15. It's time for me to get rewarded. And he doesn't understand, in the deep state apparatus, you're always the servant. You're never the master. And all of a sudden here in the United States, if you were tracking Justice Department stuff, which I tend to do because I do a lot of criminal defense work, but also to see what's happening politically behind the scenes, all of a sudden, Kolomoisky's reported to be under criminal investigation. They start seizing a bunch of his U.S. assets. They bring 4 forfeiture actions in 4 different parts of the United States. And what it was a message to, not only it was to tell Kolomoisky, back off, sit down, we run the show, you don't. It was also a message to Zelensky. You're not going to do a peace deal. You're not going to reward your oligarch. You're going to do what we tell you to do. We control your political future. We control your financial future. Yeah. We control whether you live or die next week. And that message was delivered. And if you watch Zelensky, it's from that point that those things happen over a 6-9 month time period. That's when he shifts all of a sudden his rhetoric. And as soon as Trump is out, because the message was clear, don't be too public while Trump is here, because Trump isn't on board with any of this. As soon as Trump was out, that's when all of a sudden Zelensky's back on stage now doing a deep state dance he wasn't doing before. And the history of, Kolomoisky just stays low. There's rumors and stories he's been indicted here in the United States, but it was a political indictment. It was there as leverage. He just, he's hanging out in the French Riviera, with the yachts and the rest. He's got Israeli citizenship, so anytime he needs to go and avoid extradition, he can. But that was it showed how much control they had. They took him out of being a major power player in Ukraine just to make a point to Zelensky and everybody else, all the other oligarchs in Ukraine that are profiting and grifting off the Ukrainian regime. We are in charge, you're not. That is what Victoria Nuland meant in 2014, when she was caught on tape saying F the EU. saying, no, the deep state apparatus that runs the show, and everybody else is subservient to us and within us. Now, it's not a pro-American regime, because these are people that would fly a Ukrainian flag before they'll fly an American flag outside their home. But it is a sense of the mindset, the mentality of this group of people. But I think they're losing, and they're going to lose unless they're able to stage a last-minute recovery with I think it would have to be a false flag event. And the Ukrainian false flags aren't flying well enough. The people are like, yeah, okay, it's Ukraine. It's not our problem. And because there's so many fake stories, a lot of the independent analysts are like, I don't have any confidence that this really happened. I mean, when you're losing the like ordinary everyday data nerd on YouTube, the Military and Foreign Affairs channel, the Defense Politics Asia, any of those groups, when they're like, I'm not buying that this is what necessarily happened, then you're in serious trouble. They need a false flag staged event on American or European soil. If they don't get it, they're not going to get the justification to militarily intervene with troops on the ground or planes in the air. And Russia will win this battle against basically the globalists. And they'll have some nice ports in Odessa to add to the rest of the Russian government.
Again, Robert, I completely agree. I think that was a tour de force, if I may say. I think you're absolutely right. I think you summed up Zelensky exactly right, by the way. I mean, I've been following him, and I think you're absolutely right. And Kolomoisky as well. And by the way, I pronounce his name in exactly the same way as you, and I'm sure that is the right way. Anyway, we've been going on for 2 hours and 10 minutes. Maybe this might be a good place to stop. What do you all think?
Oh yeah, no, I think we've covered the landscape well. I recommend
we've covered the landscape very well. I think what we will do, we've got lots and lots of questions. Alex and I will go through them. We might have to turn to you on occasion for some of them, Robert, especially if they deal with particular questions that are addressed specifically to you. But can I just say, this has been a tremendous program altogether.
Oh, absolutely, and I recommend everybody to the Duran.locals.com, like vivabarnes.locals.com. Some of the best part of it, vivabarneslaw.locals.com, is the community. You know, the comments, ideas, suggestions, like the Taiwan aspect, that there was, there's like that this is a little bit different than is perceived in certain political circles in the United States was very useful. They often provide the best leads of other articles, other information. For Alex's Clown World stuff, I mean, I'm getting that from a lot of, it's one story after the next. I mean, it's unimaginable. I mean, it's like, what world are we living in? Even the Nazis didn't do some of these things. I mean, this is just beyond insanity.
I think I'm going to have to actually do videos which are Clown World, and then do the final segment is going to be, okay, now this is the serious stuff. Invert it.
Absolutely. I mean, trees, they literally banned a tree. They banned a cat and they banned a tree. So I was trying to figure out what else they could ban. Maybe the egg next, the Faberge egg, maybe that will be banned. You cannot even design an egg to have an egg within an egg because it is of Russian origin.
Well, Robert, you sent me the tweet from Michael Tracy with the what is it? The Ukraine dining fee?
Ukraine tax. Yeah, it's a 1% tax that restaurants are randomly imposing on people in America, and you have to affirmatively object. And you know what's going to happen? They're going to be like, so you're anti-Ukraine? So you're pro-Putin? You like terrorism? You have a little Hitler statue at home when you get home? That kind of routine. It's insanity built on insanity. Now the problem is, it doesn't work with a resilient American populist public, especially after the last Iraq War. And what the neocons never understood is the Bushite coalition was dead and gone in 2006. It ain't ever coming back. That McCain and Romney losing, even to an relatively policy unpopular, never personally unpopular, but policy unpopular Obama, should have been a warning sign to him, but it wasn't. That's why they were shocked by Trump's rise. That's why they were shocked by J.D. Vance's win. That's why they'll continue to be shocked. But that's why I tell people, listen to what Alex Jones says on these kind of topics. So whatever you think of him, even if you dislike him or hate him, if you want to know where the populist zeitgeist is and where it's headed, Alex Jones is the best predictor in the business. There's a reason why when they did a poll 4 or 5 years ago of media personalities, they looked at who had the strongest fan base, who had a very favorable rating. Alex Jones had a very favorable rating of with more than 30 million Americans. He was the #1 independent media person who had that intensity of fan support. The snobs in the conservative political establishment pretend he doesn't exist. They don't realize his voice matters a lot more than Sean Hannity's voice.
Yeah.
I'll agree with that. I will definitely agree with that.
Yeah.
Fantastic show. Robert, you are without a doubt a treasure of information. I really, I'm not joking. I really enjoyed this show a lot.
Yeah.
Alexander?
Oh yeah, this is fantastic. This is one of
I
my
think
favorites.
this is, I thought so. I thought it was one of our, I thought it was a vintage one.
We
Treasure
covered
of
so much
information
ground.
and of analysis. Absolutely.
And I really, really hope, Robert, that your one prediction about a false flag does not come true.
Oh yes.
I hope on that prediction that that you are wrong.
Yeah.
Agreed. I mean, and I've been trying to figure out how they would do it. And I haven't figured it out. It's like, how do you get it something that looks like a Russian attack on, I mean, maybe something over Poland. I could see kind of that maybe somehow. The Polish are happy to accommodate. That's clear.
How would they do it though? How?
Yeah, I don't know. They're definitely not on U.S. soil. What, are they going to try to do something in Alaska? But trying to figure out, like, there's not a lot of places. Maybe a fake U.S. submarine, probably maybe a fake submarine attack. If I were to do it, that's where I'd do it. And I'd hit some conservative town.
Could you say something like what they're trying to do with Moldova, where you're getting these conflicting reports where
they're trying to present that.
Yeah, Moldova's saying it's the Russians that shelled, and the Russians are saying it's the Ukraine. I mean,
they thought that suburb story would work in the States.
Yeah.
Nobody cared at the end of the day. I mean, that's their problem. Though, and you look at least America's history, I don't know of it other than the first Iraq War is probably the only example. Even Panama we pitched as Noriega's dumping drugs into America. It's the first Iraq War is the only one really since in the whole history of American foreign interventionism, direct overt military intervention. I recognize a lot of coups and whatnot, but I'm talking about the direct military troops on the ground, which is what they need because Ukraine needs U.S. Air Force in the air. And they need U.S. soldiers on the ground. They need trained soldiers that know how to use a lot of these weapons. Right there, they need Normandy style kind of landings and activities there. Now it'd probably come through Poland, but that would be otherwise they're going to lose in 60 days. Well, put it this way, they may not be officially over. It'll be all but officially over in 60 days, given how things are proceeding in the East. And their inability. If you can't even take back Snake Island, it's a tiny little island that nobody really cares about. That's off the coast of Romania. It's like, so what? Russians only originally took it just to not have the Ukrainians interfere with their naval operations. But they didn't even set up anything that could reach Odessa in terms of artillery on the island. And yet they lose what? It was an 8-10. According to the Russian Ministry of Defense, they lost a bunch of aircraft, lost a bunch of drones, lost some planes, lost a bunch of soldiers. I mean, it's like, why? So that gives you a mindset for where Ukraine is. I think I've been trying to think of what, and maybe people in the comment section.
Maybe what goes through my head with the false flag is that maybe they'll do something along the lines of Skripal, Navalny poisonings.
Yeah,
that's the only thing I can think of.
Maybe that's how they finally get rid of Joe. And all of a sudden Joe and Kamala suddenly boom, and then we bring in a well-respected former Secretary of State to be our temporary U.S. president, Hillary Rodham Clinton. Maybe that could work. If for it to really resonate in the American public, they need something like a submarine hitting a place. They need something the equivalent of a bomb or a missile. They could fake something. They could say a Russian's coming across the border with some, maybe, but they don't want to do that because they want an open border for political reasons. So that's our maybe some of the script writers and idea generators on the comment section and in our locals pages, maybe they'll come up with what the highest risk is. Because the last time I was seriously thinking about a false flag or a staged event or an induced event was before January 6th. And I convinced myself that due to the high levels of security around the Capitol on that day, that couldn't happen. I never anticipated that security would be unusually low that day. And all of a sudden what happened. And they've been using that to script a narrative in the U.S. ever since. Didn't quite achieve the level that they wanted. They wanted, Patriot Act Part 2. They already all that.
I just wanted to say I have to go because there's been a ring on my front door. I know what it's all about. I need to find out. I'll be back in a moment.
Yeah.
No problem.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I just can't see the. That's what I've been trying to figure out what it could be, and how do you do it? Or maybe a release of a dangerous biological weapon. Maybe that you blame on the Russians.
Graham was talking about it on Brett Baer again. Lindsey Graham was talking again about biochemical and tactical nuke. And Brett Baer actually gives the question. So Brett Baer asks Lindsey Graham, so when is Russia going to take action against Poland and Moldova? And I'm just sitting there going, why is Russia going to take action against Poland or Moldova?
Clearly they're writing the script.
Doesn't make any.
I think all that, like, what made me nervous when they kept saying Russia's going to declare war on May 9th, I was like, if we apply that confession through projection filter, it means they're trying to come up with an excuse for us to declare war against Russia formally.
Yeah.
And it's been that confession through projection filter has been highly predictive, frighteningly. I was like, if Ukraine says, here's the Russian casualties, it ends up looking a lot like what people estimate the Ukrainian casualties to be.
Yeah.
I mean, it's parallel at so many levels.
Yes.
And so my concern, I don't think they can stage a false flag event inside. Maybe they would do it. Hungary wouldn't work, but I mean, I think that it appears to have been a Ukrainian rather than a Polish person who dumped that whatever that was on the Russian ambassador, all the red paint or whatnot.
That's what they're saying. Yeah, that's what they're saying.
So that wouldn't surprise me, but you can't really use a Ukrainian refugee to pull off. I've tried to figure out where it's got to be in continental Europe at least.
Yeah,
they would really like it to be in the United States, and it needs to. If you look at the Maine and the other examples, I don't think they could pull another Gulf of Tonkin incubator baby story. I don't think that would work.
No.
I think they need some real dead people.
Yeah.
And so the question is what that would look. Maybe a sub attack that almost missed, or officially missed, that kind of routine, and pretend it's a Russian sub. That would be a potential, because there's plenty of Russian subs off our coast. Maybe a biological. You're right. They've mostly talked about biological weapons. So that would suggest the actual use of it. But for it to be politically effective enough to try to generate enough support, short-term support to have military intervention, it honestly needs to be on American soil in all likelihood, or at least 2 Americans. So it could be Americans in another location, maybe in Europe or elsewhere. And but that's the risk. I mean, that's the. Now I know people say whether a full NATO war against Russia, who would win. I mean, obviously, it depends on no nuclear weapons being used. I mean, because that's the ultimate game changer. I understand the Russian fans think that the U.S. and NATO wouldn't win. Put it this way, I don't think Putin wants to find out.
No, exactly. Yeah,
I don't think any of us want to find out.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think that's. I agree.
We all need to stay away from that happening. That's my opinion on that. Alexander, you're battling a cold, just a cold.
I'm battling a cold.
It's just a cold, everybody.
And yeah, absolutely. It's just a cold, guys. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, let's end it there. Robert, once again, where can people find you? And I will put the link in the description box down below.
At vivabarneslaw.locals.com. That's where you can get all the content and contribute your own.
Definitely plug into Robert's local community, and along with Viva, they are fantastic. Thank you to our moderators. I saw Valley S there. I saw Alan. I saw Reckless Abandon as well. Did I miss any moderators? Thank you, guys, for helping out in the stream. And thank you to everyone who saw us on Rumble, on Odyssey, and on YouTube, and of course, our great locals community as well. We will answer all the questions, and any questions directed towards Robert, we will search out Robert and get an answer from him as well. All right, everybody, take care, and thank you for joining us for this live stream. Bye-bye.